Chapter 19. By What We Think. The Realm of Thought. A student of occultism trains himself in the art of thinking, and consequently his thought is much more powerful than that of the untrained man, and is likely to influence a wider circle and to produce a much greater effect. This happens quite outside of his own consciousness, without his making any effort in the matter. But precisely because he has learnt the mighty power of thought, it becomes his duty to use it for the helping of others. In order to do this effectively, he must understand exactly how it acts. One of the most striking characteristics of the unseen world which lies all about us is the ready response of the finer type of matter of which it is constructed to the influences of human thought and emotion. It is difficult for those who have not studied the subject to grasp the absolute reality of these forces, to understand that their action is in every respect as definite upon the finer type of matter as is that of steam or electricity upon physical matter. Every one knows that a man who has at his disposal a large amount of steam power or electrical power can do useful work and produce definite results. But few people know that every man has at his disposal a certain amount of this other and higher power, and that with that he can produce results just as definite and just as real. As matters stand at present in the physical world, only a few men can have at their disposal any large amount of its forces, and so only a few can become rich by their means. But it is a prominent feature of the vivid interest of the unseen side of life that every human being, rich or poor, old or young, has already at his disposal no inconsiderable proportion of its forces. And therefore the riches of these higher worlds, which are obtained by the right use of these powers, are within the reach of all. Here, then, is a power possessed by all, but intelligently used as yet by few. It is surely well worth our while to take up the matter, to inquire into it and try to comprehend it. Indeed, there is even more reason for so doing than has yet been mentioned, for the truth is that to some extent we are all already unconsciously making use of this power, and because of our ignorance we are employing it wrongly, and doing harm with it instead of good. The possession of power always means responsibility, so in order to avoid doing harm unintentionally, and in order to utilize thoroughly these magnificent possibilities, it will clearly be well for us to learn all that we can on this subject. The effects of thought. What then is thought, and how does it show itself? It is in the mental body that it first manifests itself to the sight of the clairvoyant, and it appears as a vibration of its matter, a vibration which is found to produce various effects, all of them quite in line with what scientific experience in the physical world would lead us to expect. There is the effect produced upon the mental body itself, and we find that to be of the nature of setting up a habit. There are many different types of matter in the mental body, and each of them appears to have its own special rate of undulation, to which it seems most accustomed, so that it readily responds to it and tends to return to it as soon as possible when it has been forced away from it by some strong rush of thought or feeling. A sufficiently strong thought may for the moment set all the particles of one division of the mental body swinging at the same rate, and every time that happens it is a little easier for it to happen again. A habit of moving at that rate is being set up in these particles of the mental body, so that the man will readily repeat that particular thought. There is the effect produced upon the other vehicles of the man, which are above and below the mental body in degree of density. We know that physical disturbances in one type of matter are readily communicated to another type, that, for example, an earthquake, which is a movement in solid matter, will produce a mighty wave in the sea, which is liquid matter. And again from the other side that the disturbance of the air, which is gaseous matter, by a storm will immediately produce ripples, and shortly great waves in the ocean beneath it. In just the same way a disturbance in a man's astral body, which we commonly call an emotion, will set up vibrations in the mental body, and cause thoughts which correspond to the emotion. Conversely, the waves in the mental body affect the astral body, if they be of a type which can affect it, which means that certain types of thought readily provoke emotion. Just as the wave in mental matter acts upon the astral substance, which is denser than it is, so also does it inevitably act upon the matter of the casual body, which is finer than it. And thus the habitual thought of the man builds up qualities in the ego himself. So far we have been dealing with the effect of the man's thought upon himself. And we see that in the first place it tends to repeat itself, and that in the second it acts not only upon his emotions, but also permanently upon the man himself. Now let us turn to the effects which it produces outside of himself, that is, upon the sea of mental matter which surrounds us all, just as does the atmosphere. Every thought produces a radiating undulation, which may be either simple or complex according to the nature of the thought which gives it birth. These vibrations may under certain conditions be confined to the mental world, but more frequently they produce an effect in worlds above and below. If the thought be purely intellectual and impersonal, if, for example, the thinker is considering a philosophical system, or attempting to solve a problem in algebra or geometry, the thought wave will affect merely the mental matter. If the thought be of a spiritual nature, if it be tinged with love or aspiration or with deep unselfish feeling, it will rise upwards into the realm of the higher mental, and may even borrow some of the splendor and glory of the intuitional level, a combination which renders it exceedingly powerful. If on the other hand the thought is tinged with something of self or of personal desire, its oscillations at once draw downwards and expend most of their force in the astral world. All these thought waves act upon their respective levels just as does a wave of light or sound here on the physical. They radiate out in all directions, becoming less powerful in proportion to their distance from their source. The radiation not only affects the sea of mental matter which surrounds us, but also acts upon other mental bodies moving within that sea. We are all familiar with the experiment in which a note struck on a piano or a string sounded on a violin will set the corresponding note sounding upon another instrument of the same kind which has been tuned exactly to the same pitch. Just as the vibration set up in one instrument is conveyed through the air and acts upon the other instrument, so is the thought vibration set up in one mental body conveyed by the surrounding mental matter and reproduced in another mental body, which, stated from another point of view, means that thought is infectious. We will return to this consideration later. Every thought produces not only a wave but a form, a definite, separate object which is endowed with force and vitality of a certain kind, and in many cases behaves not at all unlike a temporary living creature. This form, like the wave, may be in the mental realm only, but much more frequently it descends to the astral level and produces its principal effect in the world of emotions. The study of these thought forms is of exceeding interest. A detailed account of many of them, with colored illustrations of their appearance, will be found in the book Thought Forms. At the moment we are concerned less with their appearance than with their effects and with the way in which they can be utilized. Let us consider separately the action of these two manifestations of thought power. The wave may be simple or it may be complex, according to the character of the thought. But its strength is poured out chiefly upon some one of the four levels of mental matter, the four subdivisions which constitute the lower part of the mental world. Most of the thoughts of the ordinary man center round himself, his desires and his emotions, and they therefore produce waves in the lowest subdivision of the mental matter. Indeed, the part of the mental body built of that kind of matter is the only one which is as yet fully evolved and active in the great majority of mankind. In this respect the condition of the mental body is quite different from that of the astral vehicle. In the ordinary cultured man of our race the astral body is as fully developed as the physical, and the man is perfectly capable of using it as a vehicle of consciousness. He is not yet much in the habit of so using it, and is consequently shy about it and distrustful of his powers, but the astral powers are there, and it is only a question of becoming accustomed to their use. When he finds himself functioning in the astral world, either during sleep or after death, he is fully capable of sight and hearing, and can move about whithersoever he will. In the heaven world, however, he finds himself under very different conditions, for the mental body is as yet by no means fully developed, that being the part of its evolution upon which the human race is at the present moment engaged. The mental body can be employed as a vehicle only by those who have been specially trained in its use under teachers belonging to the great brotherhood of initiates. In the average man its powers are only partially unfolded, and it cannot be employed as a separate vehicle of consciousness. In the majority of men the higher portions of the mental body are as yet quite dormant, even when the lower portions are in vigorous activity. This necessarily implies that while the whole mental atmosphere is surging with thought waves belonging to the lowest subdivision, There is as yet comparatively little activity on the higher subdivisions, a fact which we shall need to have clearly in mind when we come to consider presently the practical possibility of the use of thought power. It has also an important bearing upon the distance to which a thought wave may penetrate. To help us to understand this, we may take an analogy from the action of the voice of a public speaker. He can make himself heard to a certain distance, a distance which depends upon the power of his voice. In the case of a thought form, that power corresponds to the strength of the vibrations. But the distance to which a speaker can be understood is quite another matter, and depends often more upon the clearness of his enunciation than the strength of his voice. That clearness of enunciation is represented in the case of a thought form by definiteness, clearness of outline. Many a man who is not trained in the art of public speaking might send forth a shout which would penetrate to a considerable distance, but would be quite unintelligible. Just in the same way, a man who feels strongly, but is not trained in the art of thinking, may send forth a powerful thought form which conveys strongly enough the feeling which inspires it, a feeling of joy, of terror, or of surprise. And yet it may be so vaguely outlined as to impart no idea of the nature or the cause of the emotion. Evidently, therefore, dearness of thought is at least as necessary as strength of thought. Again, the speaker's voice may be clear and strong, and his words may be perfectly audible at the place where an auditor is standing. Yet the words convey no meaning to that auditor if he is so preoccupied with some other matter that he is not paying attention. This also has its exact correspondence in the world of thought. One may send out a clear, strong thought, and even aim it definitely at another person, but if that man's mind is entirely preoccupied with his own affairs, the thought form can produce no impression upon his mental body. Often men in a wild panic do not even hear the advice or orders shouted to them. Under the same influence they are equally impervious to thought forms. The majority of mankind do not know how to think at all, and even those who are a little more advanced than that, rarely think definitely and strongly. Except during the moments in which they are actually engaged in some piece of business which demands their whole attention. Consequently, large numbers of minds are always lying fallow all about us, ready to receive whatever seed we may sow in them. The thought wave. The action of the thought vibration is eminently adaptable. It may exactly reproduce itself, if it finds a mental body which readily responds to it in every particular, but when this is not the case, it may nevertheless produce a marked effect along lines broadly similar to its own. Suppose, for example, that a Catholic kneels in devotion before an image of the Blessed Virgin. He sends rippling out from him in all directions strong, devotional thought waves. If they strike upon the mental or astral body of another Catholic, they arouse in him a thought and feeling identical with the original. But if they strike upon a Christian of some other sect, to whom the image of the Blessed Virgin is unfamiliar, they still awaken in him the sentiment of devotion, but that will follow along its accustomed channel, and be directed towards the Christ. If they touch a Mohammedan, they arouse in him devotion to Allah, while in the case of a Hindu the object may be Krishna, and in the case of a Parsi Ahura. They excite devotion of some sort wherever there is a possibility of response to that idea. If this thought wave touches the mental body of a materialist, to whom the very idea of devotion in any form is unknown, even there it produces an elevating effect. It cannot at once create a type of undulation to which the man is wholly unaccustomed, but its tendency is to stir a higher part of his mental body into some sort of activity, and the effect, though less permanent than in the case of the sympathetic recipient, cannot fail to be good. The action of an evil or impure thought is governed by the same laws. A man who is so foolish as to allow himself to think of another with hatred or envy, radiates a thought wave tending to provoke similar passions in others, and though his feeling of hatred is for someone quite unknown to these others, and so it is impossible that they should share his feeling, yet the wave will stir in them an emotion of the same nature towards a totally different person. The thought form. The work of the thought form is more limited, but much more precise than that of the wave. It cannot reach so many persons, indeed, it cannot act upon a person at all unless he has in him something which is harmonious with the vibrant energy which ensouls it. The powers and possibilities of these thought forms will perhaps be clearer to us if we attempt to classify them. Let us consider first the thought which is definitely directed towards another person. When a man sends forth from himself a thought of affection or of gratitude, or unfortunately it may be sometimes of envy or jealousy, towards someone else, such a thought produces radiating waves precisely as would any other, and therefore tends to reproduce its general character in the minds of those within the sphere of its influence. But the thought form which it creates is imbued with definite intention, and as soon as it breaks away from the mental and astral bodies of the thinker, it goes straight towards the person to whom it is directed and fastens itself upon him. If he happens at the moment to be thinking of nothing in particular, and is consequently in a passive condition, it at once penetrates his mental and astral bodies and is lost in them, just as a comet might fall into the sun. It tends to arouse in them vibrations similar to its own, which means that the man will begin to think upon that particular subject, whatever it may be. If he is in a condition of mental activity, and any part of that activity is of the same nature as the arriving thought form, it enters his mental body through that part of it which is expressing the sympathetic thought, and adds its strength to that thought. If the recipient's mind is so preoccupied that the thought form cannot find entrance, it will hover about him until he is sufficiently disengaged to give it an opportunity to gain its object. In the case of a thought which is not directed to some other person, but is connected chiefly with the thinker himself, as indeed are the majority of men's thoughts, the wave spreads in all directions as usual. But the thought form floats in the immediate neighborhood of its creator, and its tendency is constantly to react upon him. As long as his mind is fully occupied with business, or with a thought of some other type, the floating form waits, biding its time. But when his train of thought is exhausted, or his mind for a moment lies fallow, it has an opportunity to react upon him. And it immediately begins to repeat itself, to stir up in him a repetition of the thought to which he has previously yielded himself. Many a man is surrounded by a shell of such thought forms, and he frequently feels their pressure upon him, a constant suggestion from without of certain thoughts. And if the thought be evil, he may believe himself to be tempted by the devil, whereas the truth is that he is his own tempter and that the evil thoughts are entirely his own creation. There is the class of thought which is neither centered round the thinker nor specially aimed at any person. The thought form generated in this case does not hang about the thinker, nor has it any special attraction towards another man, so it remains idly floating at the place where it was called into existence. Each man, as he moves through life, is thus producing three classes of thought forms. Those which shoot straight out away from him, aiming at a definite objective. Those which hover round him and follow him wherever he goes. Those which he leaves behind him as a sort of trail which marks his route. The whole atmosphere is filled with thoughts of this third type, vague and indeterminate. As we walk along we are picking our way through vast masses of them, and if our minds are not already definitely occupied, these vague, wandering fragments of other people's thoughts often seriously affect us. They sweep through the mind which is lying idle, and probably most of them do not arouse in it any especial interest. But now and then comes one which attracts attention, and the mind fastens upon it, entertains it for a moment or two, and dismisses it a little stronger than it was on arrival. Naturally this mixture of thoughts from many sources has no definite coherence, though any one of them may start a line of associate ideas, and so set the mind thinking on its own account. If a man pulls himself up suddenly as he walks along the street, and asks himself, "What am I thinking about, and why? How did I reach this particular point in my train of thought?" And if he tries to follow back the line of his thoughts for the last 10 minutes, he will probably be quite surprised to discover how many idle and useless fancies have passed through his mind in that space of time. Not 1/4 of them are his own thoughts, they are simply fragments which he has picked up as he passed along. In most cases they are quite useless, and their general tendency is more likely to be evil than good. What we can do by thought. Now that we understand to some extent the action of thought, let us see what use it is possible to make of this knowledge, and what practical considerations emerge from it. Knowing these things, what can we do to forward our own evolution, and what can we do to help others? Obviously, a scientific consideration of the way in which thought works, exhibits it as a matter of far greater importance, not only for our own evolution but also for that of others, than is ordinarily supposed. When we look at this question of thought with regard to its effects upon others, we find ourselves brought back again from this different point of view to every one of the considerations which we have already emphasized when speaking of the reaction of this force upon ourselves. This is natural, for what tends to our progress must tend also to that of others. So we must touch these subjects again, though but in passing. Since every thought or emotion produces a permanent effect by strengthening or weakening a tendency, and since furthermore every thought wave and thought form must not only react upon the thinker, but also influence many other people, the greatest care must be exercised as to the thought or emotion which a man permits within himself. The ordinary man rarely thinks of attempting to check an emotion. When he feels it surging within him he yields himself to it and considers it merely natural. One who studies scientifically the action of these forces realizes that it is his interest as well as his duty to check every such upwelling, and consider, before he allows it to sway him, whether it is or is not prejudicial to his evolution and to that of his neighbors. Instead of allowing his emotions to run away with him he must have them absolutely under control. And since the stage of evolution at which we have arrived is the development of the mental body, he must take this matter seriously in hand and see what can be done to assist that development. Instead of allowing the mind to indulge in its vagaries he should endeavor to assert control over it, recognizing that the mind is not the man, but is an instrument which the man must learn to use. It must not be left to lie fallow. It must not be allowed to remain idle, so that any passing thought form can drift in upon it and impress it. The first step towards control of the mind is to keep it usefully occupied, to have, as has already been said, some definite, good and useful set of thoughts as a background to the mind's operation, something upon which it shall always fall back when there is no immediate need for its activity in connection with duty to be done. Another necessary point in its training is that it shall be taught to do thoroughly that which it has to do, in other words, that the power of concentration shall be acquired. This is no light task, as any unpracticed person will find who endeavors to keep his mind absolutely upon one point even for 5 minutes. He will find that there is an active tendency to wander, that all kinds of other thoughts thrust themselves in. The first effort to fix the mind on one subject for 5 minutes is likely to resolve itself into spending 5 minutes in bringing the mind back again and again from various side issues which it has followed. Fortunately, though concentration itself is no easy thing, there are plenty of opportunities for attempting it, and its acquisition is of great use in our daily life. We should learn then, whatever we are doing, to focus our attention upon it and to do it with all our might and as well as it can be done. If we write a letter, let that letter be well and accurately written, and let no carelessness in detail delay it or mar its effect. If we are reading a book, even though it be only a novel, let us read it with attention, trying to grasp the author's meaning, and to gain from it all that there is to be gained. The endeavor to be constantly learning something, to let no day pass without some definite exercise of the mind, is a most salutary one, for it is only by exercise that strength comes, and disuse means always weakness and eventual atrophy. It is also of great importance that we should learn to husband our energy. Each man possesses only a certain amount of energy, and he is responsible for its utilization to the best advantage. The ordinary man wastes his force in the most foolish manner. He is always frittering it away without a shadow of necessity or justification. Sometimes he is full of eager desire for something which is quite unnecessary. Or he is full of worry about some fancied evil which he imagines may be impending. At another time he is deeply depressed, but does not know exactly why. But whatever he alleges as the ostensible cause, the fact remains that he is more or less in a condition of excitement and agitation, because he will not take things philosophically, and lay to heart the wise old maxim that, as regards what comes upon us from the outer world, nothing matters much, and most things don't matter at all. The thoughts and emotions of an average crowd are like the inhabitants of a disturbed ant-hill, all rushing wildly and aimlessly about in different directions, but causing a vast amount of disorder and tumult. Which is precisely why the occultist invariably avoids a crowd, unless duty takes him into it. It is especially necessary for the student of occultism to learn to avoid this dissipation of his energies. One way in which the average man wastes a great deal of force is by unnecessary argument. It appears to be impossible for him to hold any opinion, whether it be religious or political, or relating to some matter in ordinary life, without becoming a prey to an overmastering desire to force this opinion upon everyone else. He seems quite incapable of grasping the rudimentary fact that what another man chooses to believe is no business of his. And that he is not commissioned by the authorities in charge of the world to go round and secure uniformity in thought and practice. The wise man realizes that truth is a many-sided thing, not commonly held in its entirety by any one man, or by any one set of men. He knows that there is room for diversity of opinion upon almost any conceivable subject, and that therefore a man whose point of view is opposite to his own may nevertheless have something of reason and truth in his belief. He knows that most of the subjects over which men argue are not in the least worth the trouble of discussion, and that those who speak most loudly and most confidently about them are usually those who know least. The student of occultism will therefore decline to waste his time in argument. If he is asked for information he is willing to give it, but not to waste his time and strength in unprofitable wrangling. Another painfully common method of wasting strength is that worry of which I have already written as so serious an obstacle in the path of peace. Many men are constantly forecasting evil for themselves and for those whom they love, troubling themselves with the fear of death and of what comes after it, with the fear of financial ruin or loss of social position. A vast amount of strength is frittered away along these unprofitable and unpleasant lines. But all such foolishness is swept aside for the man who realizes that the world is governed by a law of absolute justice, that progress towards the highest is the divine will for him, that he cannot escape from that progress. That whatever comes in his way and whatever happens to him is meant to help him along that line, and that he himself is the only person who can delay that advance. He no longer troubles and fears about himself and about others, he simply goes on and does the duty that comes nearest in the best way that he can, confident that if he does that, all will be well for him. He knows that worry never yet helped any one, nor has it ever been of the slightest use, but that it has been responsible for an immense amount of evil and waste of force, and the wise man declines to spend his strength in ill-directed emotion. So we see that if it is necessary for his own evolution that man should keep mind and emotion under control, and not foolishly waste his force, it is still more necessary from another point of view. Because it is only by such care that he can enable himself to be of use to his fellow men, that he can avoid doing harm to them and can learn how to do good. If, for example, he lets himself feel angry, he naturally produces a grave effect upon himself, because he sets up an evil habit and makes it more difficult to resist the evil impulse next time it assails him. But he also acts seriously upon others around him, for inevitably the vibrations which radiate from him must affect them also. If he is making an effort to control his irritability, so perhaps are they, and his action will help or hinder them, even though he is not in the least thinking of them. Every time that he allows himself to send out a wave of anger, that tends to arouse a similar vibration in the mind or astral body of another, to arouse it if it has not previously existed and to intensify it if it is already present. And thus he makes his brother's work of self-development harder for him, and places a heavier burden upon his shoulders. On the other hand, if he controls and represses the wave of anger, he radiates instead, calming and soothing influences which are distinctly helpful to all those near him who are engaged in the same struggle. Few people realize their responsibilities in this matter. It is bad enough surely that any evil thought of ours should communicate itself to the minds of any persons within range of us who may happen to be idle and unoccupied. But the truth is much worse than that. In every man there lie germs or possibilities of evil which have come over from a previous life, but have not as yet been called into activity in this incarnation. If we send out an evil or impure thought, it may easily happen that it arouses into activity one of these germs, and so through our lack of self-control there comes into that man's life an evil of which otherwise he might have got rid. We revive in him the dormant tendency which was in the act of dying out, and thereby we delay him in his upward progress. So long as that germ is dormant the quality is dying out, but when it is aroused again it may increase to any extent. It is like breaking a hole through a dike and letting out the water. In fact, a man who sends out an evil thought cannot tell for what amount of evil he may make himself responsible. For a man who becomes wicked, in consequence of that thought, may in turn affect other people, and those yet others in turn, so it is actually true that because of one evil thought generations yet to come may suffer. Happily all this is true of good thoughts as well as of evil, and the man who understands this fact uses wisely the power which it gives him, and may have an influence for good which is beyond all calculation. The responsibility of thought. Possessing this tremendous power, we must be careful how we exercise it. We must remember to think of a person as we wish him to be, for the image that we thus make of him will naturally act powerfully upon him, and tend to draw him gradually into harmony with itself. Let us fix our thoughts upon the good qualities of our friends, because in thinking of any quality we tend to strengthen its vibrations, and therefore to intensify it. From this consideration it follows that the habit of gossip and scandal, in which many people thoughtlessly indulge themselves, is in reality heinous wickedness, in condemning which no expression can be too strong. When people are guilty of the impertinence of discussing others, it is not usually upon the good qualities that they most insist. We have therefore a number of people fixing their thought upon some alleged evil in another, and calling to that evil the attention of others who might perhaps not have observed it. And in this way, if that bad quality really exists in the person whom they are so improperly criticizing, they distinctly increase it by strengthening the undulation which is its expression. If, as is usually the case, the depravity exists only in their own prurient imagination, and is not present in the person about whom they are gossiping, then they are doing the utmost in their power to create that evil quality in that person. And if there be any latent germ of it existing in their victim, their nefarious effect is only too likely to be successful. We may think helpfully of those whom we love, we may hold before them in thought a high ideal of themselves, and wish strongly that they may presently be enabled to attain it. But if we know of certain defects or vices in a man's character, we should never under any circumstances let our thoughts dwell upon them and intensify them. Our plan should be to formulate a strong thought of the contrary virtues, and then send out waves of that thought to the man who needs our help. The ordinary method is for one to say to another, "Oh my dear, what a terrible thing it is that Mrs. So-and-so is so ill-tempered. Why, do you know, only yesterday she did this and that, and I have heard that she constantly, etc., etc. Isn't it a terrible thing?" And this is repeated by each person to her 30 or 40 dearest friends, and in a few hours several hundred people are pouring converging streams of thought, all about anger and irritability, upon the unfortunate victim. Is it any wonder that she presently justifies their expectations, and gives them yet another example of ill-tempered over which they can gloat? A person wishing to help in such a case will be especially careful to avoid thinking about anger at all, but instead will think with force. I wish Mrs. So-and-so were calm and serene, she has the possibility of such self-control within her. Let me try frequently to send her strong, calm, soothing thought waves, such as will help her to realize the divine possibility within her. In the one case the thought is of anger, in the other it is of serenity. In both alike it will inevitably find its goal, and tend to reproduce itself in the mental and astral bodies of the recipient of the thought. By all means let us think frequently and lovingly of our friends, but let us think of their good points only, and try, by concentrating our attention upon those, to strengthen them and to help our friends by their means. A man often says that he cannot control his thoughts or his passions, that he has often tried to do so, but has consistently failed, and has therefore come to the conclusion that such effort is useless. This idea is wholly unscientific. If an evil quality or habit possesses a certain amount of strength within us, it is because in previous lives we have allowed that strength to accumulate because we have not resisted it in the beginning when it could easily have been repressed, but have permitted it to gather the momentum which makes it difficult now to deal with it. We have, in fact, made it easy for ourselves to move along a certain line, and correspondingly difficult to move along another line, difficult, but not impossible. The amount of momentum or energy accumulated is necessarily a finite amount. Even if we have devoted several lives entirely to storing up such energy, an unlikely supposition, still the time so occupied has been a limited time, and the results are necessarily finite. If we have now realized the mistake we made, and are setting ourselves to control that habit and to neutralize that impetus, we shall find it necessary to put forth exactly as much strength in the opposite direction as we originally spent in setting up that momentum. Naturally, we cannot instantly produce sufficient force entirely to counteract the work of many years, but every effort which we make will reduce the amount of force stored up. We ourselves as living souls can go on generating force indefinitely. We have an infinite store of strength on which to draw, and therefore it is absolutely certain that if we persevere we must eventually succeed. However often we may fail, each time something is withdrawn from that finite store of force, and it will be exhausted before we shall, so that our eventual success is simply a matter of mechanics. The knowledge of the use of these thought currents makes it possible for us always to give assistance when we know of some case of sorrow or suffering. It often happens that we are unable to do anything for the sufferer physically. Our bodily presence may not be helpful to him, his physical brain may be closed to our suggestions by prejudice or by religious bigotry. But his astral and mental bodies are far more easily impressible than the physical, and it is always open to us to approach these by a wave of helpful thought or of affection and soothing feeling. The law of cause and effect holds good just as certainly in finer matter as in denser, and consequently the energy which we pour forth must reach its goal and must produce its effect. There can be no question that the image or the idea which we wish to put before the man for his comfort or his help will reach him. Whether it will present itself clearly to his mind when it arrives depends, first upon the definiteness of outline which we have been able to give to it, and secondly upon his mental condition at the time. He may be so fully occupied with thoughts of his own trials and sufferings that there is little room for our idea to insert itself. But in that case our thought form simply bides its time, and when at last his attention is diverted, or exhaustion forces him to suspend the activity of his own train of thought, ours will at once slip in and do its errand of mercy. There are so many cases where the best will in the world can do nothing physically, but there is no conceivable case in which either in the mental or the astral world some relief cannot be given by steady, concentrated, loving thought. The phenomena of mind cure show how powerful thought may be even in the physical world, and since it acts so much more easily in astral and mental matter we may realize vividly how tremendous the power really is, if we will but exercise it. We should watch for every opportunity of being thus helpful. There is little doubt that plenty of cases will offer themselves. As we walk along the street, as we ride in a tramcar or railway train, we often see someone who is obviously suffering from depression or sadness. There is our opportunity, and we may immediately take advantage of it by trying to arouse and to help him. Let us try to send him strongly the feeling that, in spite of his personal sorrows and troubles, the sun still shines above all, and there is still much for which to be thankful, much that is good and beautiful in the world. Sometimes we may see the instant effect of our effort, we may actually watch the man brighten up under the influence of the thought which we have sent to him. We cannot always expect such immediate physical result. But if we understand the laws of nature we shall in every case be equally sure that some result is being produced. It is often difficult for the man who is unaccustomed to these studies to believe that he is really affecting those at whom his thought is aimed. But experience in a great number of cases has shown us that anyone who makes a practice of such efforts will in time find evidence of his success accumulating until it is no longer possible for him to doubt. The man should make it part of his life thus to try to help all whom he knows and loves, whether they be living or what is commonly called dead. For naturally the possession or the absence of the physical body makes no difference whatever to the action of forces which are leveled at the mental and astral bodies. By steady, regular practice of this sort great good will be done, for we gain strength by practice, and so, while we are developing our own powers and ensuring our progress, the world will be helped by our kindly efforts. Thus whatever is truly for our own interest is also for the interest of the world, and what is not good for the world can never in reality be for our interest either. For all true gain is gained for all. To many a man this may appear a strange statement, because we are accustomed to think that what one man gains another loses, yet it enshrines a great truth. Elsewhere I have shown that if one party to a transaction is unfairly treated, and therefore loses, there is no true gain for the other. A straightforward, honest piece of business means gain for both parties. A tradesman, let us suppose, buys his goods wholesale, and then, taking care to say of them only what is strictly true, disposes of them by retail at a reasonable profit. Here all parties gain, for the wholesale merchant and the tradesman make their living, while the purchasers are willing to pay the retail price in order to have the convenience of buying in small quantities. Each person gains what he wishes. No one loses, all are satisfied. This is merely a superficial example from the physical world. It is in the higher realms of thought that we may see most clearly how beautifully this rule works. Suppose that a man gains knowledge. He may impart his gain to 100 others, yet he himself will have lost nothing. Not only so, but even others, to whom he does not impart it, will gain indirectly from his possession of it. Because he has this added knowledge, he is by so much a wiser and more useful man, his words should be the more weighty, his actions the more sagacious, and so others around him should be the better for his learning. We may go deeper still. Since the man knows more, not only his words and action but his thoughts will be wiser than before. His thought forms will be better, the waves flowing from his mental body higher and richer. And these must inevitably produce their result upon the mental bodies of others around him. Like all other waves in nature, they tend to reproduce themselves, to provoke a similar rate of undulation in anything with which they come into contact. The same natural law, by the action of which in the physical world you are able to boil the water for your tea or to toast your bread at the fire, makes it absolutely certain that the good effects of additional wisdom will influence others. Even though the possessor speaks never a word. That is why in all religions so much importance is attached to the company of the good, the wise, the pure. Human qualities are infectious, and it is of the greatest moment that we should be careful to which of them we subject ourselves. Take another instance. Suppose that you gain the valuable power of self-control. Perhaps you were formerly a passionate man, and now you have learnt to check that outpouring of force, and to hold it in subjection. Let us see how that affects others about you. In the physical world it is unquestionably pleasanter for them, but let us consider the effect on their finer vehicles. When in earlier days you allowed yourself to get into a rage, great waves of strong wrath poured out from you in all directions. No one who has seen the illustration of such an outrush as that which appears in man visible and invisible, will need to be told what disastrous effects such waves must have produced upon the astral bodies of those who were so unfortunate as to be near you. Perhaps one of those men was himself struggling the same evil habit. If so, the emanations of your fury stirred up similar activity in his astral body, and so you strengthened that evil, you made your brother's task harder, and his burden heavier to bear than it otherwise would have been. And once more I must insist that you have no right to do that. But now that you have gained self-control, all this is most happily changed. Still you radiate vibrations, for that is nature's law, but now they are no longer the lurid flashes of anger, but the calm, measured sweep of the strong waves of love and peace. And these also impinge upon the astral body of your fellow man, and tend to reproduce themselves in him, and if he is fighting a battle against passion, their stately rhythm helps him and steadies him. Your force is being exerted on his side instead of against him, and so you lighten his burden, you aid him on his upward path. Is it not true then that in your gain he has gained also? Men are so inextricably linked together, humanity is so truly a unity amidst all its marvelous diversity, that no one can advance or recede without helping or hindering the progress of others. Wherefore it behoves us to take heed that we are among the helpers and not among the hinderers, and that no living being, whether man or animal, shall ever be the worse for any thought or word or deed of ours. Chapter 20. By what we do. Work for the poor. The question of what we can do is one which it is impossible to treat fully, for the reason that each person has his own opportunities, and no two sets of opportunities are alike. We are often asked whether a theosophist should undertake any of the ordinary charitable lines of work, which are not specially connected with the Theosophical Society. This is a question which each must answer for himself, because the answer to it depends on his special circumstances. I think that it may be laid down as a general rule that when there is specially theosophical work that he can do, he should devote his time to that, because that is a kind of business that only he can do. Whereas many other people can do the ordinary charitable labor as well as he. Take for example a case of what is called slum work, the direct help of the poor by visiting them and carrying to them various small comforts. None can deny that this is a most excellent thing to do, and that it sadly needs doing. But if one is to choose between spending a certain time in this distinctly physical occupation and doing something in a higher world which will tend to bring nearer the time when slums shall no longer exist, then I say that the latter is the greater work to do and the better way of employing the time, for only one who has studied theosophy can help to spread the theosophical teaching, whereas any good and kind-hearted person, of whatever class, can undertake the task of carrying food and blankets to the poor. It is good work, surely, to help to make a road, but we should not put to that task of road-making a man who has qualified himself as an engineer or a doctor. Any man who has a talent in a certain direction or has the knowledge necessary to enable him to work in a particular way, should be employed along his special line, for there are only a few who can do that. Whereas anyone can do the unskilled labor of the world, and there are vast numbers who can do only that. Therefore it seems to me that when a theosophist can employ his time in spreading and teaching theosophy, he should not put this aside in order to take up a more ordinary kind of work for the world. But if he is so situated that he cannot do anything for the theosophical propaganda which is his speciality, he ought certainly then to employ his spare time in the highest type of charitable labor within his reach. What is required is that he should cultivate a spirit of benevolence, that he should be eagerly watching all day long for opportunities of being helpful. Best of course if he can be useful in the highest way, is guiding people towards theosophy, but when that is not for the moment possible, he should be helpful in a more ordinary manner. He should employ himself in sending out benevolent thoughts, or in making people happy in the physical world. He should import the idea of helpfulness into every little daily action. Each man must decide for himself how he can best do this, and his study of the hidden side of things will offer him many suggestions, for it makes daily life much more interesting, and enables us much more useful than we could be without it. It shows us that many apparently trivial actions reach further than we think, and therefore impresses strongly upon us the necessity for living carefully and recollectedly. It shows a man that every action has its effect upon those around him, even when it seems on the surface to concern himself alone, that for this effect on others he is responsible, and that it offers him a welcome opportunity for doing good. When this is once grasped, he realizes that he must order his life from this new point of view, that it must be spent, even in small things, not for himself, but for others. Many a man lives for others in the sense that he regulates his life on what he imagines others are thinking about him, but our student's altruism will be of another sort. He will put before himself for his guidance two stringent rules. That everything shall be done unselfishly. That everything shall be done with definite purpose, and as perfectly as he can do it. The force of the master. If he does this, if he lives in this way, the powers who rule the world will soon recognize him and use him, for by living thus he makes himself a ready channel for the power of the master. A valuable instrument in his hands. Truly, the help of the holy ones is given chiefly upon higher planes, but it is not confined to them, it acts in the physical world as well, if we give it the opportunity. The master will not waste his strength in forcing a stream of his energy down into the dense matter of this lower world, because to do that would not be good spiritual economics, it would not be utilizing that amount of energy to the best advantage. But if a man already living in our lower world so arranges his life as to make himself a fit channel for that energy, the position is altered. And it becomes worth the master's while to make an effort which would not otherwise have been remunerative. We have to remember that a channel must be open at both ends, not at one end only. The higher end of our channel consists in the devotion and unselfishness of the man, in the very fact that he is anxious to be used, and is ordering his life for that purpose. The lower end is the man's physical body, through which the influence must pass out, and this also needs careful attention, in order that it may not befoul the stream which the master sends. Remember that we are dealing with no vague abstraction, but with a physical though invisible fluid, which permeates the matter of the body and exudes through the pores of the skin, or is projected from the hands or feet. Therefore that body must be pure inside, uncontaminated by flesh foods, alcohol or tobacco, and it must also be kept scrupulously clean outside by frequent and thorough ablutions, especial attention being paid to the hands and feet. Otherwise the fluid, transmuted with so much care from higher planes, will be polluted as it passes through man, and will fail to achieve the object for which it was sent. Although this force radiates from the worthy student at all times, he can also gather it up and pour it out with definite intention upon a particular object. In a previous chapter it was explained how the ordinary man can protect himself from evil influence when shaking hands, or when surrounded by a crowd. But the student, instead of protecting himself, will make out of these unpleasing occurrences opportunities to act upon others. When he shakes hands with a man, he will send the master's power rushing through his extended arm. The beginner may ask, how can I do that? And even if I try, how can I be certain that I have succeeded? All that is needed here is a firm conviction and an intense resolve, a conviction, based upon his study, that this is a thing that can be done, and the intense resolve to do it, which comes from his deep devotion to the Master and his earnest desire to do his will. Success in all magical efforts depends upon the absolute confidence of the operator. A man who doubts his own capacity has already failed. So that all that is necessary is that he should mingle with the hearty welcome which he extends to his visitor the strong thought, I give you here with the love of the Master. In the same way, when he finds himself in a crowd, he will spread among the people that same influence of the Master's love, and that outpouring will be for him a far better protection than any shell. The manufacture of talismans. Another use which can be made of this force is to charge certain objects with it, thereby converting them into talismans. I have written before of the effects producible by such charms. I speak now of the process of their manufacture. The more advanced branches of this art require definite knowledge, obtainable only by an extended course of study. But any earnest man can make a temporary talisman which will be of great use to one who needs help. One who is accustomed to the work can perform any ordinary process of magnetization or demagnetization practically instantaneously by the mere exertion of his will. But the beginner usually finds it necessary to help himself in the concentration of his will by thinking carefully of the various stages of the process and using the appropriate gestures. Suppose, for example, that it is desirable to magnetize some small body, such as a ring, a locket, a penholder, in order to make it an amulet against fear. What is the easiest method of procedure? Realize first exactly what is wanted. We wish to load that body with etheric, astral and mental matter heavily charged with a particular set of undulations, those of courage and confidence. The trained occultist would gather together each of those levels such types of matter as will most easily receive and retain vibrations of just that character. The beginner, knowing nothing of that, must use whatever material comes to hand and so will have to expend a greater amount of force than would be exerted by his more experienced brother. The making of an amulet may be likened to the writing of an inscription, and the acquisition of the right kind of matter corresponds to obtaining a perfect surface on which to write. The beginner, who cannot do this must write with greater labor and less perfection of result upon the surface that happens to be available. The first difficulty that confronts him is that his sheet is not even a blank one. His paper already bears an inscription, which must be removed before he can use it. If the ring or locket has been worn by anyone, it is already full of the magnetism of that person, magnetism which may be better or may be worse than that of the student, but is at any rate different from it. And so is an obstacle, just as any kind of writing, however good, which already fills a sheet of paper, stands in the way of its use for further writing. Even if the ring or penholder be quite new, it is likely to contain something of the special magnetism either of the maker or of the seller. So in any case the first thing is to remove whatever may be there, to obtain a clear sheet for our inscription. There are various methods by which this may be done. Let me describe a simple one. Rest the tip of the forefinger of the right hand against the end of the thumb, so as to make a ring, and imagine a film of ether stretched across that ring like the head of a drum. Will strongly that such a film should be made, and remember that that very effort of the will does make it, although you cannot see it. Remember also that it is essential to the success of the experiment that you should be quite certain of this fact, that your previous study should have convinced you that the human will has the power to arrange subtle matter in this or any other way. Then, keeping your attention firmly fixed upon that film, so as to hold it quite rigid, pass slowly through it the object to be demagnetized, and by so doing you will cleanse it entirely of the etheric part of its previous magnetism. I do not mean that you will leave it without etheric matter, but that every particle of such matter will be swept out and replaced, just as, if a tube is filled with gas and one blows strongly into one end of it, all the gas is driven out. But the tube is not therefore empty, as the pressure of the surrounding air immediately refills it. So the specially charged ether is dredged out of the locket or penholder, and its place is taken by the ordinary ether which interpenetrates the surrounding atmosphere. The next step is to let the etheric film dissolve, and replace it by one of astral matter, through which the object is again passed. The process may be repeated with a film of mental matter, and we shall then have the object entirely free on all three planes from any sort of specialized magnetism, a clean sheet, in fact, upon which we can write what we will. After a certain amount of practice the student can make a combined film containing etheric, astral and mental matter, so as to perform the whole operation by passing the object once through the ring. The operator must then exercise all his strength to fill himself with the qualities which he wishes the amulet to convey, in this case fearlessness and self-reliance. Excluding for the moment all thought of other attributes and becoming the living incarnation of these. Then, when he has thus wound himself up to his highest level of enthusiasm, let him take the object in his left hand, or lay it on the table in front of him, and pour magnetism on it through the fingers of his right hand. All the time willing with his utmost strength that it shall be filled with the very essence of valor, calmness and intrepidity. It will probably help him in concentration if, while doing this, he repeats to himself firmly again and again such words as, courage, confidence, in the name of the Master, where this object is, may no fear enter. Or any others expressing a similar idea. Let him do this for a few minutes, never allowing his attention to swerve for a moment, and he need have no shade of doubt that he has made a really effective talisman. This process will probably occupy the tyro for some time, but a man who is accustomed to it does it quickly and easily. The trained occultist makes constant use of this power as a means of helping those with whom he comes into contact. He never dispatches a letter, or even a postcard, without thinking what good gift of refreshing, consoling or strengthening magnetism he can send with it. He has at his command many other ways of making a talisman besides that which I have described. Perhaps it may help towards a fuller comprehension of the subject if I enumerate some of them, even though they are quite beyond the reach of the ordinary student. Varieties of talismans. Amulets are of all sorts and kinds, literally many thousands of kinds, but they may be arranged for our purposes into 4 classes, which we will call respectively general, adapted, and sold and linked. General. The method which I have suggested above produces a talisman of this description. The trained man naturally obtains with less labor a better result, not only because he knows how to use his will effectively, but because he has learnt to select the most suitable materials. Consequently the influence of his amulet is stronger, and lasts for many years instead of perhaps for a few months. This form of talisman is quite simple. Its business is to pour out a steady stream of undulations expressing the quality with which it is charged, and it will continue to do this with undiminished vigor for a period the length of which depends upon the force originally put into it. 2. Adapted. The adapted amulet is one that has been carefully prepared to fit a particular person. Its maker studies the man for whom it is intended, and notes carefully the deficiencies in his mental, astral and etheric bodies. Then he culls from the matter of the various planes the ingredients of his talisman, just as a physician selects the drugs to compound into a prescription, choosing a certain type of essence in order to repress an undesirable astral tendency. Another in order to stimulate the sluggish action of some defective department of mental activity, and so on. Thus he produces an amulet accurately adapted to the needs of a particular person, and capable of doing for that person enormously more than a general talisman can do, but it would be of little use to anyone else but the man for whom it is intended. It is like a skillfully made key with many wards, which exactly fits its lock, but will not open any other, while a general talisman may be compared to a skeleton key, which will open many inferior locks, but does not perfectly suit any. 3. Ensouled. Sometimes it is desired to establish a center of radiation which, instead of acting for a few score years at most, shall continue its outpouring through the centuries. In this case it is not enough to charge the selected object with a dose of magnetic force, for, however large that dose may be, it must sometime be exhausted. To produce this more permanent result we must bring into play some form of life. And for this purpose one of two methods is usually adopted. The first is to include in the physical charm a minute fragment of one of those higher minerals which are sufficiently alive to throw out a ceaseless stream of particles. When that is done, the store of force poured into the amulet will last almost indefinitely longer, for instead of radiating steadily in all directions on its own account, it remains self-contained, and charges only the particles which pass through it. The work of distribution is thus done by the mineral, and a vast economy of energy is thereby secured. The second plan is so to arrange the ingredients of the talisman as to make it a means of manifestation for any one of certain comparatively undeveloped orders of nature spirits. There are tribes of these creatures which, though full of energy and strongly desirous to do something with it, cannot express themselves unless they can find some sort of outlet. It is possible so to magnetize an amulet as to make it precisely the kind of outlet required, and thus to ensure the steady outflow through it of a stream of energy at high pressure, which may last for thousands of years. To the intense delight of the nature spirits and the great benefit of all who approach the magnetized center. Linked. The linked talisman differs completely from the other kinds in one important particular. All those previously described are made and set going by their creators, and then left to run their course and live their life, just as a clockmaker constructs a timepiece and then sells it to a customer and knows no more about it. But the clockmaker sometimes chooses to remain in touch with his masterpiece, and undertakes to keep it wound and in order, and this corresponds to the arrangement made in the case of a linked talisman. Instead of merely loading the object with influence of a certain type, the operator when he magnetizes it brings it into close rapport with himself, so that it may become a kind of outpost of his consciousness. A sort of telephone receiver always connected with him, through which he can reach the holder or be reached by him. An amulet of this type does not work mechanically upon the gyroscope principle, as the others do. Or perhaps I should rather say it has a slight action of that sort, because it so strongly suggests the presence of its creator that it often acts as a deterrent, preventing the wearer from doing what he would not like the maker to see him do. But its principal action is of quite another kind. It makes a link through which the wearer can at a critical moment send a cry for help to its builder, who will instantly feel the appeal and respond by an outpouring of strength of whatever type may be required. Its manufacturer can also use it as a channel through which he can send periodic waves of influence, and so administer a course of treatment, a kind of emotional or mental massage. Such a method of handling a case, I believe our Christian Science friends call it absent treatment, may be undertaken without an amulet, merely by projecting astral and mental currents. But a talisman makes the work easier, and enables the operator to deal more readily with the etheric double of the subject. Usually the link is made only in the physical, astral and lower mental worlds, and is therefore confined to the personality of its constructor. But there are instances when a great one has chosen to link a physical talisman to himself in his causal body, and then its influence lasts through the ages. This was done in the case of the physical objects buried at various points of future importance by Apollonius of Tyana. Demagnetization. It not infrequently occurs that it is desirable to demagnetize objects which are larger than those instanced above. In such cases one may hold the two hands at the requisite distance apart, and imagine a broad band of etheric matter extending between them, with which the previous magnetism can be dredged out as before. Another plan is to hold the two hands one on each side of the object, and send a strong stream of etheric matter through it from one hand to the other, thus washing away the undesired influence. The same force can often be employed in the same way to relieve pain. A headache, for example, is usually either caused or accompanied by a congestion of etheric matter in the brain. And it can often be cured by that same plan of putting the hands one on each side of the sufferer's temples and washing away the congested matter by an effort of the will. Another use to which the power of demagnetization can be put is to clear objectionable influences out of a room. One may have a visitor who leaves an unpleasant atmosphere behind him. Or one may find uncomfortable astral conditions prevailing in one's apartment at a hotel, and if such an emergency arises, it is useful to know how to deal with it. One practiced in these mild forms of magic would manage the business in a few moments by the exercise of his trained will, but the younger student will probably find it better to employ intermediate means, precisely as the Catholic Church does. The cubic content of even a small room is too great for the employment of the dredging tactics previously recommended, so we must invoke the great principle of sympathy and antipathy, and set up within the room a series of vibrations so hostile to the evil influence that the latter is dominated or driven forth. To create such an undulation is not difficult, but means must be found for spreading it rapidly all over the room. One ready method is the burning of incense or pastilles, another is sprinkling of water. But both incense and water must first be passed through the process recommended for the making of a talisman. Their original magnetism must be removed, and they must be loaded with the thought of purity and peace. If that be thoroughly done, when the incense is burned, its particles, each bearing the desired influence, will quickly be disseminated through every cubic inch of air in the room. Or if water be used and sprinkled about the chamber, each drop of it will at once become a center of active radiation. A vaporizer is an even more effective method of distribution. And if rose water be used instead of ordinary water, the work of the student will be considerably facilitated. The method of action of these etheric or astral disinfectants is obvious. The disturbing influence of which we desire to rid ourselves expresses itself in etheric and astral waves of a certain length. Our magnetic efforts fill the room with another set of waves, different in length and more powerful, because they have been intentionally set swinging, which probably the others were not. The two sets of inharmonious vibrations cannot coexist, and so the stronger overpowers and extinguishes the weaker. These are some of the ways in which the force that dwells within man, the force that flows through man, may be used. In this case, as in every other, knowledge is power. In this case, as in every other, additional power means additional responsibility in additional opportunity. If you can readily develop this power, if you can do these things quickly and easily, so much the better for you, so long as you use this advantage unselfishly, and make the world by its means a little happier, a little better, a little cleaner as the result of your efforts. Do little things well. Remember the second maxim that everything shall be done as perfectly as we can do it. Charge your letter with magnetism and make a talisman of it, by all means, you will do great good thereby. But do not forget that the mere physical handwriting must be perfect also, first, out of courtesy to the recipient, and secondly, because all work done for the master must be done with the utmost care, even to the minutest detail. And as all our work is work for him, executed in his name and to his glory, that means that nothing must ever be done carelessly. In this, too, unselfishness may be applied. No one has the right to cause trouble to another by illegible handwriting, to save a few moments of his own time by wasting many minutes of another's. We must not think that because we know more of the hidden side of things than others, and so are able to add unexpected blessings to daily acts, we are thereby absolved from doing the ordinary part of those acts to the very best of our ability. Not worse but better than that of others must our work be, in every respect and from every point of view, for the honor of the Master whom we serve. What the work is that he gives us, matters little, that it should be nobly done matters supremely. And the man who, all his life through, does the small, daily details well and carefully, will not be found wanting when some day he suddenly finds himself face to face with a great opportunity. The little things in life weigh more than the big things. There are so many of them, and it is so much more difficult to go on steadily doing them. Saint Augustine remarked, "Many there be who will die for Christ, but few there be who will live for him." Many of us would instantly and gladly do some great thing for the Master, but he does not commonly ask for that. He asks us to live our daily life nobly, not for ourselves but for others, to forget ourselves, only to remember the good of mankind. Let us then form the habit of helpfulness, for it soon becomes a habit, like everything else. It certainly makes life more interesting, and, above all, it brings us every day nearer to Him. Writing a letter. I mentioned some pages back that an occultist never dispatches a letter without putting into it something of strength and encouragement. But it does not need person of a great advancement to perform so elementary an act of magic as this. Anyone may do it with a little trouble, when he understands how these forces work. We all know that when a psychometrist takes a letter into his hand he can describe the personal appearance of the writer, the condition of his mind at the time of writing, the room in which he was sitting, any other people who happen to be present, and even the surrounding scenery. It is manifest, therefore, that a letter brings with it much more than the message written in it, and though only one who is developed as a psychometrist may be able to sense this with sufficient clearness to reduce it to actual vision, yet an effect of some sort must obviously be produced even upon those who do not fully see. The vibrations upon which the psychometrist's observations are founded are there, whether there is or is not anyone present who can see by their means, and they must affect to some extent anyone with whom they come directly into contact. This being so, we see that here is an opportunity for the person who understands. The student can learn the operation of these forces, and can then direct them intelligently as he will. Suppose, for example, he wishes to write a letter of condolence and consolation to some friend who has, as we mistakenly phrase it, lost someone near and dear to him. We all know the difficulty of writing such a letter. In attempting it we put upon the paper whatever of solace comes into our minds, and we try to express it as forcefully and sympathetically as we can, yet we are conscious all the while that words are impotent in such a case, and that they can bring but poor comfort to the bereaved one. We feel the futility and inefficiency of our communication, though we send it because we wish to express our commiseration, and we know that we ought to do something. Such a letter need not be fruitless and unavailing. On the contrary, it may produce the most beneficent effect, and may lead to great alleviation of suffering. Words often fail us, but our thoughts do not. And in the writing of such a letter a man's heart may be filled with the strong wish to bring encouragement and help, however poorly the written lines may express it. If he exercises his will he may make that letter bear with it his thought and feeling, so that they shall react upon the mind and emotions of the recipient, while his eyes are perusing the manuscript. We know that currents of thought and feeling can be sent to the mourner immediately and without the physical agency of a letter. And one who has no other pressing work could undoubtedly console and strengthen the sufferer by pouring upon him a steady stream of such thought and feeling. The writing of the letter by no means precludes the student from offering efficient help in that other way as well, but it usefully supplements such work, and carries it on while the student is otherwise engaged. Those who are trying on their small scale to help the world soon find that they have a multitude of cases upon their hands, and that they can work best by dividing their time between them. The more advanced student will leave with each such case a puissant thought form, which will radiate invigoration and cheerfulness until he can again turn his attention to that case. But one who has not yet developed his powers to that extent may readily produce an effect almost equivalent, if he has a physical basis upon which to found the thought form. A letter furnishes him with exactly such a basis, and into it he can pour healing and strengthening forces until it becomes a veritable talisman. If the writer thinks strongly of his sympathy and affection, and wills earnestly to charge the letter with this thought and feeling, it will assuredly bear this message for him. When it reaches its destination the friend who opens it will naturally recognize the kindly intention of the sender, and by that very recognition will open himself towards the influence, and adopt unconsciously a recipient attitude. As he reads the written message, the helpful thoughts and feelings are playing all the while upon his mind and emotions, and the effect produced upon him will be out of all proportion to the mere physical words. The action of the letter does not cease here. The recipient reads it, lays it aside and perhaps forgets it, but its vibrations are nevertheless steadily radiating, and they continue to influence him long after the letter itself has passed from his mind. If he happens to put the letter in his pocket and carry it about with him, its influence upon him will naturally be closer and stronger. But in any case such a letter of helpfulness and good intention will fill the whole room with peace and comfort, so that the mourner will feel its effect whenever he enters his chamber, however unconscious he may be as to its source. Obviously it is not only for consolation that this power can be employed. A mother, who feels uneasy as to the temptations which may surround an absent son, may send him letters which will encompass him with a halo of purity and peace, and bear him unconscious and uncontaminated through many a scene of peril. A multitude of words is not necessary, even a humble postcard may bear its message of love and strength, and may be a real shield against evil thought, or an impulse in the direction of good. It may occur to some readers that a letter is handled by so many persons before it reaches its destination that any magnetism that it might bring with it would necessarily be of mixed character. There is much truth in this. But the postmen, the sorters, and the servants who handle it have no special interest in it, and consequently such influence as their thoughts may exercise upon it is of the most superficial character. Whereas the writer has intentionally thrown into it a wealth of feeling which has thoroughly permeated it and is strong enough to overpower all casual connections of this sort. Incidentally, this helps us to understand that there is always a responsibility attached to this action of writing a letter. We may charge our writing voluntarily with a great force for good, and that needs a special effort of the will. But even without any special effort, our mood when writing undoubtedly impresses itself upon the paper, though naturally not so strongly. If therefore a man be in a condition of irritation or depression when inditing a letter, these emotions of his will be faithfully mirrored in his work, and the letter will bear these vibrations with it and radiate them to the recipient. Even though they are not at all intended for him, and the original annoyance or depression was in no way connected with him. If on the other hand the writer is serene and happy, a letter for him, even though it be nothing but a curt business communication, will contain within itself something of these qualities, and will spread a good influence around it. It is therefore exceedingly necessary that a person among whose duties it comes to write many letters should cultivate serenity and kindliness, and should endeavor to hold himself in a sympathetic and helpful frame of mind, in order that his letters should carry with them this good influence. One who is captious and critical, dictatorial and ill-tempered, is entirely unfit to hold any secretarial position, as he will inevitably distribute discomfort and dissension to all those who are so unfortunate as to have to correspond with him. The preference which many sentimental people feel for a letter written in manuscript, rather than for one produced by means of a typewriter, is due to the fact that in passing the hand again and again over the paper a much greater amount of personal magnetism is stored in the letter than when the hand does not come directly into contact with it. Though a student of occultism who writes a letter in type charges it with magnetism by a single effort of his will far more effectually than it is unconsciously charged when written by the hand of one who has not learnt these truths. The occultist extends this idea in many other directions. Every present which he gives to a friend is made to produce a far more permanent result than the mere pleasure that is caused by its arrival. If he gives or lends a book to someone, he does not forget to add to the arguments of the author his own earnest desire that the reader's thoughts may be widened and liberalized. Let us all try to spread help and blessing in this way. Assuredly our efforts will not fail to bring about their due effect. Every object about us must be a center of influence, and we may make its action strong or weak, useful or detrimental. It is for us therefore to see that whenever we make a present to a friend its influence shall be powerful and definite, and always for good. These matters are little studied yet in the outer world, but they represent great truths for all that. Wise men will pay attention to them and govern their lives accordingly, and thereby make themselves both far happier and far more useful than those who are content to remain ignorant of the higher science. Work during sleep. One of the most pleasing of the subsidiary points revealed to us by theosophical study is that of the possibility of usefully employing the hours during which the body is sleeping. I well remember in my younger days how fiercely I resented the necessity of spending time in sleep when there was such an overwhelming amount of work to be done, and how I consequently tried to minimize the time devoted to this. Being healthy and hearty, for some years I managed to exist on only 4 hours of sleep each night, and thought that I was thereby gaining time for the work which I had to do. Now that I know more about it, I realize that I was in error, how that I could actually have increased my usefulness if I had allowed myself to take an ordinary amount of rest. Besides providing myself with a still stronger body for the work of my later years. But it was indeed a comfort to me when I found from the theosophical literature that only the body is insensible during sleep, and that the real man can continue his work and indeed do all the more of it, and do it better. Because he is untrammeled by his physical vehicle. Yet even theosophical students, who are quite accustomed to think about the higher worlds and the possibility of activity in them, often do not realize how entirely that is the real life, and this in the physical world only an interlude in it. In our waking consciousness most of us always consider the diurnal life as real, and the nocturnal or dream life as unreal. But in truth the very reverse is the case, as may easily be seen if we remember that in this life most of us know nothing whatever of that, whereas in that life we remember the whole of this. This life, therefore, has long daily breaks in its continuity, that is continuous from the cradle to the grave and beyond it. Furthermore, because during that life the physical body is for the time laid aside, the ego can manifest much more of himself. The man in his astral body is much more nearly himself than this fettered representation of him which is all that we can see down here. When, later on in our evolution, further development takes place and the man can function in his mental body, we are another whole stage nearer to the reality. Indeed, beyond that it is only one stage to the manifestation of the ego in his causal body, having a unified consciousness which extends through all the ages. From the time when long ago he rose from the animal kingdom to the infinity which lies before him. Let us see then what we can do with this life at night, while we leave our physical body to its rest. Many forms of activity open before us, and as I have written fully about them in the book called Invisible Helpers I will not repeat myself here. I may summarize by saying that during our waking hours we can help anyone whom we know to be in sorrow or suffering, by sitting down and forming a clear strong thought image of the sufferer, and then pouring out a stream of compassion, affection and strength. But during the night we can do more than this, we can carry this treatment further, because we can ourselves go in the astral body and stand by the bedside of the sufferer, so as to see exactly what is needed. And give whatever may be specially required by the particular case, instead of offering merely general comfort and consolation. Help and encouragement can be given not only to the living but also to the vast host of the dead, and they often seriously need it, owing partly to the false and wicked religious teaching which is so often given, and partly to the blank ignorance of other-world conditions which obtains among the general public on this side of the veil. In such work as this there is infinite variety, yet even this by no means exhausts the possibilities which open before us. In the astral world we can both give and receive instruction. From the anonymity of the astral world we can assist, inspire and advise all sorts of people who would be unlikely to listen to us physically. We can suggest good and liberal ideas to ministers and statesmen, to poets and preachers, and to all the many varieties of writers in books, magazines and newspapers. We can suggest alike plots to novelists and good ideas to philanthropists. We are free to range wherever we will and to do whatever work presents itself to us. Incidentally we can visit all the interesting spots of the world, and see all its most magnificent buildings and its most lovely scenery. Its finest art and its grandest music are entirely at our disposal, without money and without price, to say nothing of the far grander music and the far more splendid coloring of the astral world itself. What can a man do down here to prepare himself to take part in that higher work? Well, the life is a continuous life, and whatever characteristics a man shows here in his physical body he will assuredly also show in his astral body. If here he is full of cheerfulness and always anxious for an opportunity to do service, then, even though he may remember nothing of it, he may be quite confident that he is employing himself usefully to the utmost of his capacity in the astral realm also. Any limitations of character which show themselves down here, such as irritability, for example, are certainly contracting the sphere of his usefulness in the astral world. And so, if a man who does not bring through any recollection from that life wishes to make quite sure that he is well employed there and is doing his full duty, he can easily be certain of it by carefully making his life here such as he knows to be necessary for that purpose. There is no mystery as to the requirements. Single-mindedness, calmness, courage, knowledge and love will make a thoroughly useful astral worker, and all these qualifications are within reach of any man who will take the trouble to develop them in himself. It is not difficult to see why all these are necessary. A man cannot throw all his energy into such work as this unless the higher life is for him the one object. Knowledge of the astral world, its habitants and its characteristics he must have. Otherwise he will constantly blunder, and will find himself helpless before every emergency which arises. Courage he obviously needs, just as does the man who plunges into unexplored jungles or trusts himself on the surface of the mighty deep. Calmness also he must have, for though it is a sufficiently serious matter for a man to lose his temper in the physical world, it is something infinitely more serious when there is no physical matter to prevent the full swing of the vibrations of anger. Any manifestations of irritability, excitement or impatience in the astral world at once make him a fearsome object, so that those whom he wishes to help fly from him in terror. Love of humanity, and the consequent earnest desire to help, he must possess in the fullest degree. For without that he can never have the patience to deal gently with the panic fear and the unreasoning stupidity which we so often find among the dead. For many of the cases with which we have to deal such exceeding gentleness and long-suffering are required that no man, however energetic and earnest he may be, is of use in dealing with them unless he is full of real affection and has his vehicles perfectly under control. Much work is done in the astral world besides that in which we are most specially interested. Many physicians visit, during the sleep of the body, cases in which they are keenly interested or about which they feel anxious. In most cases the man in the physical body is not conscious of this, but any new information that he gains from his astral investigations, often comes through as a kind of intuition into the waking consciousness. I have known doctors who are able to do this intentionally and in full consciousness, and naturally this capacity gives them a great advantage over their colleagues. A doctor who dies, often continues after death to take an interest in his patients, and sometimes endeavors to cure them from the other side, or to suggest, to his successor in charge of the case, treatment which, with his newly acquired astral faculty, he sees would be useful. I knew one doctor, a member of our society, who immediately after his death went round to collect all his patients who had passed over before him, and regularly preached theosophy to them. So that he now goes about in the astral world with a large band of attendant disciples. I have known many cases also of friendships formed in the astral world. It often happens, for example, that members of our society who live at opposite sides of the world and have no opportunity of meeting physically, yet know one another well in their astral life. When they are actually on opposite sides of the world, the day of one is the night of the other, but there is generally sufficient overlapping to make acquaintance possible. Those who are ready and effective lecturers in the physical world usually continue their activities in that line during sleep. Groups of students continue their meetings and, with the additional facilities which the astral world gives to them, are frequently able to solve problems which have presented difficulties down here. Not only dead friends but living friends from the other side of the world are round us all day long, although with our physical eyes we do not see them. We are never alone, and as in the astral world most thoughts are visible, it behoves us to bear that fact in mind, lest we should carelessly send out astral or mental vibrations which would cause pain to those whom we love. Chapter 21. By Collective Thought. Church Hymns and Rituals. I in an earlier chapter 1 have explained how the congregation and the parishioners are affected by the ceremonies of the church. And from what was then said it is not difficult to see how the priest from his side can influence those about him. He has chosen a position the responsibilities of which are great, and in order to discharge them properly it is important that he should know something of the hidden side of things. That he may understand the real meaning of the services of the church to which he belongs, and how to order them aright. Much exception has been taken by the ignorant to the statement always made by the Church that the celebration of the Eucharist is a daily repetition of the sacrifice of the Christ. But when we understand from the occult point of view that sacrifice of the Christ means the descent into matter of the outpouring of the second aspect of deity, we see that the symbolism is an accurate one. Since the outflow of force evoked by the consecration has a special and intimate connection with that department of nature which is the expression of that divine aspect. The priest who comprehends this will not fail to assign to that service its due position, and will take care to surround its culminating point with whatever in the way of ritual and music will add to its effect and prepare the people to take part in it more receptively. Realizing also of how tremendous a mystery he is here the custodian, he will approach its celebration with the utmost reverence and awe, for though his attitude towards it makes no difference to the central fact and to its effects, there is no doubt that his deep devotion, his comprehension and cooperation can bring down an additional influence which will be of the greatest help to his congregation and his parish. A priest who has the advantage of being also an occultist has a magnificent opportunity of widespread usefulness. As a student of magic, he appreciates to the full the effect produced by music, and knows how to utilize it so as to produce harmonious and powerful forms. A great deal may be done by inducing the congregation as far as possible to join in the music of the Church. It is impossible that they should do so in the production of the more elaborate and magnificent forms, which produce far-reaching effects at higher levels. But they themselves may be helped to an almost incalculable extent if they can be induced to join heartily in stirring and well-chosen hymns and chants. This has been more fully recognized by the English branch of the Catholic Church than by the Roman, and a corresponding advantage has been reaped. The powerful influence of the corresponding advantage has been reaped. The powerful influence of the processional hymn must not be neglected, for this operates usefully in all directions. First, by bringing the choir down among the congregation and moving them slowly through the different sections of it, the people are greatly encouraged and help to throw themselves with vigor into the singing. Secondly, the splendid appearance of a well-organized procession, the color and light, the rich banners and splendid vestments, all combine to fire the imagination, to raise the people's thoughts above the prosaic level of ordinary life, and to help their devotion and enthusiasm. Congregations. Many of these considerations apply also to ministers of other denominations. Though they have not the power of the priest which brings them into touch with the reservoir of force arranged by the Christ for his Church, they may do a great deal for their congregations. First by their own devotion and secondly by evoking that of their people. The resources of congregational music are at their disposal, and if they can work their followers up to the required level, they also may produce the wonderful results which flow from the combined devotion of a large number of people. A grand outpouring of force, and a magnificent and effective collective thought form can thus be made by a gathering of men who join heartily in a service. But there is generally great difficulty in obtaining this result, because the members of the average congregation are entirely untrained in concentration, and consequently the collective thought form is usually a broken and chaotic mass, instead of a splendid and organized whole. When it happens that a number of occult students belong to such an assembly, they can be of great use to their fellow worshippers by consciously gathering together the scattered streams of devotion and welding them into one harmonious and mighty current. It is evident at once that every member of congregation has here a definite duty. Monasteries. Better results than those produced by an ordinary congregation are frequently obtained from the united devotions of a body of monks, because they have gradually trained themselves into something approaching to concentration, and are also well used to working together. The influence flowing from a monastery or nunnery of the contemplative order is often beautiful and most helpful to the whole countryside, a fact which shows clearly how foolish and short-sighted is the objection sometimes made by the Protestant that, while the active orders of monks are at least doing good work among the poor and the sick, those who adopt a contemplative line are merely dreaming away their lives in selfish isolation from the rest of the world. In most of such monasteries the hours of prayer are strictly observed, and the effect of this is a regular outflow of force over the neighborhood many times each day. There are some such institutions in which the scheme of perpetual adoration is carried out before the consecrated host in the chapel of the monastery, and in such a case there is a steady and powerful stream always pouring out, both night and day, bringing to the surrounding country a benefit which can hardly be overestimated. Effect upon the dead. The effect produced in all these cases is far wider than the ordinary thinker realizes. The young student of occultism, if he does not happen to be clairvoyant, sometimes finds it difficult to remember that the host of the unseen is so much greater than the number of the seen. And that therefore the people who benefit by church services or by outpourings of collective thought and feeling are not only the living but also the dead, not only human beings even, but great hosts of nature spirits and of the lower orders of the angels. Naturally, whatever feeling may be aroused in them reacts upon us in turn, so that many different factors combine to strengthen us when we make any effort for good. The Christian Church directs some of her efforts intentionally towards her departed members, and prayers and masses for the dead are a great feature of the life in Catholic countries. A most useful feature certainly. For not only do the good wishes and the outpourings of force reach and help those at whom they are aimed, but also the formation of such prayers and wishes is a good and charitable undertaking for the living. Besides providing them with a satisfactory and consolatory outlet for their feelings in the shape of doing something to help the departed instead of merely mourning for them. Saving souls. Hundreds of good and earnest people are putting a great deal of strength and devotion into efforts, as they put it, to save souls, which to them generally means imprisoning people within the limits of some particularly narrow and uncharitable sect. Fortunately, their endeavors in this particular direction are not often successful. But we must not suppose that all their energy and thought for others is therefore necessarily wasted. It does not do half the good that it would if it were intelligently directed. But such as it is unselfish and kindly meant, and so it brings down a certain amount of response from higher levels, which is poured upon both the petitioner and the object of his prayers. If the suppliant be earnest and free from conceit, nature answers the spirit rather than the letter of such a request, and brings general good and advancement to its object without also inflicting upon him the curse of a narrow theology. People who dislike ceremonies. There are in the world many people so constituted that ceremonies of any sort do not appeal to them. It may be asked what kind of provision nature makes for them, and how they are compensated for their inability to appreciate or to share in the benefits of these various lines of ecclesiastical influence of which I have written. First, to a considerable extent they do share in the benefit of them, though they would probably be the last people to admit it. Perhaps they never enter churches. But I have already described how these influences radiate far beyond the mere buildings, and how the vibrations are sent out on all levels, and consequently have something which affects all varieties of people. Still, it is clear that such men miss a good deal which the others may gain if they will. What sources then are open to them from which they may obtain corresponding advance? They cannot well gain the same uplifting, nor, I suppose, would they desire it, but they may gain a mental stimulus. Just as the thought of the great saint, radiating out all round him, arouses devotion in those who are capable of feeling it, so does the thought of the great man of science, or of anyone who is highly developed intellectually, radiate out upon the mental level and affect the minds of others, so far as they are capable of responding to it. Its action stimulates mental development, though it does not necessarily act so directly upon the character and disposition of the man as does the other influence. Perfect knowledge must make for goodness of life as much as perfect devotion. But we are as yet so far from perfection that in practical life we have to deal rather with the intermediate or even elementary stages. And it seems clear that elementary knowledge is less likely on the whole to affect the character than elementary devotion. Both are necessary, and before adeptship is reached both must be acquired in their entirety. But at present we are so partially developed that the vast majority of men are aiming at one and to some extent neglecting the other, I mean, of course, the majority of those men who are trying at all. For the greater part of the world has not arrived as yet at recognizing the necessity for either knowledge or devotion. The only organization, in Western countries at least, which fully meets and satisfies man's requirements along both these lines appears to me to be the Theosophical Society, and its meetings. Small and unimportant though they may seem to an outsider, are capable when properly managed of radiating a powerful influence which will be exceedingly useful to the community. Theosophical meetings. A meeting may produce most important results, not only for those who take part in it, but for their unconscious neighbors. But in order that it may do this, the members must understand the hidden side of their meeting, and must work with a view to produce the highest possible effects. Many members utterly overlook this most important part of their work, and have in consequence quite an unworthy idea of what the work of a lodge is. I have sometimes heard a member frankly confess that the lodge meetings are often rather dull, and so he does not always attend them. A member who makes such a remark has not grasped the most rudimentary facts about the work of the lodge. He evidently supposes that it exists for the purpose of amusing him, and if its meetings are not interesting to him he thinks that he is better off at home. The excuse for such an attitude, if there is an excuse, is that through many lives, and probably through the earlier part of this life, such a man has been looking at everything entirely from the outside and from the selfish point of view. And he is only now gradually accustoming himself to the true and higher standpoint, the common-sense attitude which takes account of all the factors, the higher as well as the lower and less important. The person who attends a meeting for the sake of what he can get, or to be entertained there, is thinking of himself only and not of his lodge or of the society. We should join the society not for anything that we get from it, but because, having satisfied ourselves of the truth of what it proclaims, we are anxious to spread that truth to others as far as possible. If we are merely selfish in regard to this matter, we can buy the theosophical books and study them without belonging to the society at all. We join it for the sake of spreading the teaching, and for the sake of understanding it better by discussing it with those who have spent years in trying to live it. We who belong to it do get a good deal from it, in the way of instruction and of help in understanding difficult points, of brotherly feeling and of kindly thought. I know that I have received much of all these things during my 30 years of membership, but I am quite sure that if I had joined the society with the idea of getting something out of it, I should not have gained half of what I have. In my experience of the society I have seen over and over again that the person who comes in with the idea, "What shall I get?" gains little, because so far as the flowing of higher forces goes he is a cul-de-sac. He is what plumbers call a dead end, out of which nothing is running. What can there be in the dead end of a pipe but a little stagnant water? But if the pipe be open and the water flows freely, then a vast amount may pass through. In the same way, if members come to a meeting, thinking all the time about themselves, and how they like what is said or done, they assuredly gain but little good from it, compared to what they might gain if their attitude were more rational. No doubt such people have spasms of unselfishness, but that is insufficient. The whole life of a member ought to be devoted to trying to fill his place well, and to do his duty to the utmost of his power. Therefore, being a member of the society and of a lodge, he has his duty to do from that point of view also. If a member says that lodge meetings are dull, one always feels inclined to begin by asking him, "What are you doing to allow them to be dull? You are there also, and it is your business to see that things are kept going as far as may be." If each individual member feels resting upon him the duty of trying to make each meeting a success, it will be much more likely to succeed than if he goes there just to be amused or even merely to be instructed. Let us consider then the hidden side of the meeting of a theosophical lodge. For the purposes of our illustration I will take the ordinary weekly meetings, at which the lodge is prosecuting its definite line of study. I am referring to the meetings of members of the lodge only, for the occult effect which I wish to describe is impossible in connection with any meetings to which non-members are admitted. Naturally the work of every lodge has its public side. There are lectures given to the public, and opportunities offered for their questions. All this is good and necessary. But every lodge which is worthy of the name is also doing something far higher than any work in the physical world, and this higher work can only be done by virtue of its own private meetings. Furthermore, it can be done only if these private meetings are properly conducted and entirely harmonious. If the members are thinking of themselves in any way, if they have personal vanity, such as might show itself in the desire to shine or to take a prominent part in the proceeding. If they have other personal feelings, so that they would be capable of taking offense or of being affected by envy or jealousy, no useful occult effect can possibly be produced. But if they have forgotten themselves in the earnest endeavor to comprehend the subject appointed for study, a considerable and beneficial result, of which they usually have no conception, may readily be produced. Let me explain the reason of this. We will assume a series of meetings at which a certain book is being used for study. Every member knows beforehand what paragraph or page will be taken at the approaching meeting, and it is expected that he shall take the trouble to prepare himself to bear his part in it intelligently. He must not be in the attitude of the young nestling, waiting with open mouth and expecting that someone else will feed him. On the contrary, every member should have an intelligent comprehension of the subject which is to be considered, and should be prepared to contribute his share of information with regard to it. A good plan is for each member of the circle to make himself responsible for the examination of certain of our theosophical books, one taking the first volume of the Secret Doctrine, let us say, another the second, another the third, another the Ancient Wisdom, another Esoteric Buddhism, and so on. Some of the members could easily take 2 or 3 of the smaller books, and on the other hand, if the lodge be large enough, a volume of the Secret Doctrine might very well be divided among several members, each taking up 100 or 150 pages. The exact subject to be considered at the next meeting is announced at the previous one, and each member makes himself responsible for looking carefully through the book or books committed to his charge for any reference to it, so that when he comes to the meeting he is already possessed of any information about it which is contained in that particular book, and is prepared to contribute this when called upon. In this way every member has his work to do, and each is greatly helped to a full and clear comprehension of the matter under consideration, because all present are thus earnestly fixing their thought upon it. When the meeting opens, the chairman will first appoint someone to read the passage chosen for study, and will then ask each member in turn what, if anything, his book has to say which bears upon it. After all have thus borne their part, questions may be asked and any points which are not quite clear may be discussed. If any question arises which the older members present do not feel themselves fully competent to answer, it should be written out and sent to the headquarters of the society. If some such plan as that be adopted, no one will have reason to complain of the dullness of the meetings, for every member will exert himself to bear his own part in each of them. Each must go to the meeting in a spirit of helpfulness, thinking of what he can contribute and in what way he can be useful, for upon the attitude of mind much depends. Let us consider what effect such a meeting will produce upon the neighborhood in which it is held. We have already noted that a church service is a powerful center of influence. How does a theosophical meeting act in this respect? To understand that, recall for a moment what has been said as to the action of thought. The thought wave may be generated at various levels of the mental body. A selfish thought uses the lowest kind of mental matter, while an unselfish thought, or an attempt to comprehend some elevated idea, uses the higher kinds only. An intense effort at the realization of the abstract, an attempt to comprehend what is meant by the fourth dimension or by the tabularity of a table, means, if successful, a dawning activity of the causal body. While if the thought is mingled with unselfish affection, with high aspiration or devotion, it is even possible that a vibration of the intuitional world may enter into it and multiply its power 100-fold. The distance to which a thought wave can radiate effectively, depends partly upon its nature and partly upon the opposition with which it meets. Waves in the lower types of astral matter are usually soon deflected or overwhelmed by a multitude of other vibrations at the same level, just as in the midst of the roar of a great city a soft sound is entirely drowned. For this reason the ordinary self-centered thought of the average man, which begins on the lowest of the mental levels, and instantly plunges down to correspondingly low levels of the astral, is comparatively ineffective. Its power in both the worlds is limited, because, however violent it may be, there is such an immense and turbulent sea of similar thought surging all around that its waves are inevitably soon lost and overpowered in that confusion. A thought generated at a higher level, however, has a much clearer field for its action, because at present the number of thoughts producing such waves is very small. Indeed, theosophical thought is almost a class by itself from this point of view. There are religious people whose thought is quite as elevated as ours, but never so precise and definite. There are large numbers of people whose thoughts on matters of business and money-making are as precise as could be desired, but they are not elevated or altruistic. Even scientific thought is scarcely ever in the same class as that of the true theosophist, so that our students have practically a field to themselves in the mental world. The result of this is that when a man thinks on theosophical subjects, he is sending out all round him a wave which is powerful because it is practically unopposed, like a sound in the midst of a vast silence. Or a light shining forth on the darkest night. It sets in motion a level of mental matter which is as yet but rarely used, and the radiations which are caused by it impinge upon the mental body of the average man at a point where it is quite dormant. This gives to such thought its peculiar value, not only to the thinker but to others round him, for its tendency is to awaken and to bring into use an entirely new part of the thinking apparatus. Such a wave does not necessarily convey theosophical thought to those who are ignorant of it. But in awakening this higher portion of the mental body, it tends to elevate and liberalize the man's thought as a whole, along whatever lines it may be in the habit of moving, and in this way produces an incalculable benefit. If the thought of a single man produces these results, the thought of 20 or 30 people directed to the same subject will achieve an effect enormously greater. The power of the united thought of a number of men is always far more than the sum of their separate thoughts, it would be much more nearly represented by their product. So it will be seen that, even from this point of view alone, it is an exceedingly good thing for any city or community that a theosophical lodge should be constantly meeting in its midst, for its proceedings, if they are conducted in a proper spirit, cannot but have a distinctly elevating and ennobling effect upon the thought of the surrounding population. Naturally there are many people whose minds cannot yet be awakened at all upon those higher levels, but even for them the constant beating of the waves of this more advanced thought at least brings nearer the time of their awakening. Nor must we forget the result produced by the formation of definite thought forms. These also are radiated from the center of activity, but they can affect only such minds as are already to some extent responsive to ideas of this nature. In these days, however, there are many such minds. And our members can attest the fact that after they have been discussing such a question as reincarnation, it not infrequently happens that they are themselves asked for information upon that subject by persons whom they had not previously supposed to be interested in it. The thought form is capable of conveying the exact nature of the thought to those who are somewhat prepared to receive it, whereas the thought vibration, though it reaches a far wider circle, is much less definite in its action. Here is already a momentous effect upon the mental level, produced quite unintentionally by our members in the ordinary course of their study, something far greater in reality than their intentional efforts in the way of propaganda are ever likely to produce. But this is not all, for by far the most important part is yet to come. Every lodge of this society is a center of interest to the great masters of the wisdom, and when it works well and loyally their thoughts and those of their pupils are frequently turned towards it. In this way a force more exalted than our own may often shine out from our gatherings, and an influence of inestimable value may be focused where, so far as we know, it would not otherwise specially rest. This may indeed seem the ultimate limit which our work can attain, yet there is something beyond even this. All students of the occult are aware that the life and light of the deity flood the whole of his system, that in every world, at every level, is outpoured from him that especial manifestation of his strength which is appropriate to it. Naturally, the higher the world, the less veiled is his glory, because as we ascend we are drawing nearer to its source. Normally the force outpoured in each world is strictly limited to it. But it can descend into and illuminate a lower level if a special channel be prepared for it. Such a channel is always provided whenever any thought or feeling has an entirely unselfish aspect. The selfish emotion moves in a closed curve, and so brings its own response on its own level. The utterly unselfish emotion is an outrush of energy which does not return, but in its upward movement provides a channel for a downpouring of divine power from the level next above, which is the reality lying at the back of the old idea of the answer to prayer. To a clairvoyant this channel is visible as a great vortex, a kind of gigantic cylinder or funnel. This is the nearest we can come to explaining it in the physical world, but it does not really give at all an adequate idea of its appearance, for as the force flows down through the channel it somehow makes itself one with the vortex, and issues from it colored by it, and bearing with it distinctive characteristics which show through what channel it has come. Such a channel can be made only if all the thought is earnest and harmonious. I do not mean that there must be no discussion at the meetings, but that all such discussion must invariably be of the most friendly character, and conducted with the fullest brotherly feeling. We must never suppose that a man differs from us is necessarily weak in thought or uncomprehending. There are always at least two sides to every question, so that the man who disagrees may often simply be seeing another side. If that is so, we may gather something from him and he something from us, and in that way we may do each other good, but if we become angry over a discussion we do each other harm and the harmony of the thought waves is lost. One such thought as that so often spoils a beautiful effect. I have seen that happen many times, a number of people working along quite happily and building up a beautiful channel. Suddenly some one of them will say something unkind or personal, and then in a moment the thing breaks up, and the opportunity to help is lost. Whenever anyone is speaking, or reading a paragraph, or trying to do anything helpful, try for the time to help him, and do not be everlastingly thinking how much better you could do it yourself. Do not criticize, but give him the aid of your thought. You may afterwards inquire as to any points that are not clear, but do not at the time send a hostile or critical thought against him, because if you do you may interfere with the sequence of his thought and spoil his lecture. Make a mental note of any point about which you wish to ask, but for the time try to see what good there is in what he says, as in that way you will strengthen him. A clairvoyant sees the current of thought flowing out from the lecturer, and other currents of comprehension and appreciation rising from the audience and joining with it. But critical thought meets it with an opposing rate of vibration, breaks up the stream, and throws it all into confusion. One who sees this influence in action will find these considerations so forcibly impressed upon him that he is little likely to forget them and act contrary to them. The helpful thoughts of members of his audience tend to make a lecturer's presentation clearer, and to impress it upon those to whom it is not familiar. For this reason members should be present even at public lectures upon the most elementary subjects delivered by their fellows, in order that they, who understand thoroughly, may help the lecturer by making clear thought forms connected with his subject, which will impress themselves upon the minds of the public who are trying to understand. The man who is occupied in the earnest study of higher things is for the time lifted entirely out of himself, and generates a powerful thought form in the mental world, which is immediately employed as a channel by the force hovering in the world next above. When a body of men join together in a thought of this nature, the channel which they make is out of all proportion larger in its capacity than the sum of their separate channels. And such a body of men is therefore an inestimable blessing to the community amidst which it works, for through them, even in their most ordinary meetings for study, when they are considering such subjects as rounds and races and planetary chains, there may come an outpouring into the lower mental world of that force which is normally peculiar to the higher mental. While if they turn their attention to the higher side of the theosophical teaching, and study such questions of ethics and of soul development as we find in At the Feet of the Master, Light on the Path, The Voice of the Silence and our other devotional books, they may make a channel of more elevated thought through which the force of the intuitional world itself may descend into the mental, and thus radiate out an influence for good upon many a soul who would not be in the least open to the action of that force if it had remained on its original level. This is the real and the greatest function of a lodge of the Theosophical Society, to furnish a channel for the distribution of the divine life, and thus we have another illustration to show us how far greater is the unseen than the seen. To the dim physical eye all that is visible is a small band of humble students meeting weekly in the earnest endeavor to learn and to qualify themselves to be of use to their fellow men. But to those who can see more of the world, from this tiny root there springs a glorious flower, for no less than 4 mighty streams of influence are radiating from that seemingly insignificant center, the stream of thought waves, the cluster of thought forms, the magnetism of the masters of the wisdom, and the mighty torrent of the divine energy. Here also is an instance of the eminently practical importance of a knowledge of the unseen side of life. For lack of such knowledge many a member has been lax in the performance of his duty, careless as to his attendance at lodge meetings. And thus he has lost the inestimable privilege of being part of a channel for the divine life. Such a man has not yet grasped the elementary fact that he joined not to receive but to give, not to be interested and amused, but to take his share in a mighty work for the good of mankind. Chapter 22. By our relation to children. From the theosophic standpoint, the subject of our relation to children is an exceedingly important and practical one. If we realize the purpose for which the ego descends into incarnation, and if we know to how great an extent its attainment of that purpose depends upon the training given to its various vehicles during their childhood and growth, we cannot but feel that a tremendous responsibility attaches to all who are in any way connected with children, whether as parents, elder relatives, or teachers. It is well, therefore, that we should consider what hints theosophy can give us as to the way in which we can best discharge this responsibility. What is the present condition of our relation to children, to boys, at any rate, here in the midst of our European civilization? The practical result of 19 centuries of ostensibly Christian teaching is that our boys live among us as an alien race, with laws and rules of life of their own, entirely different from ours, and with a code of morals of their own, also entirely different from that by which we consider ourselves bound. They regard grown-up people, in the mass, with scarcely veiled hostility, or, at the best, with a kind of armed neutrality, and always with deep distrust, as foreigners whose motives are incomprehensible to them, and whose actions are perpetually interfering in the most unwarrantable and apparently malicious manner with their right to enjoy themselves in their own way. This may sound rather a startling statement to those who have never considered the matter, but any parent who has boys at one of our large schools will appreciate the truth of it. And if he can look back to his own school days, and in thought realize once more the feelings and conditions of that period, which most of us have so entirely forgotten, he will recognize, perhaps with a start of surprise, that it is not an inaccurate description of what his own attitude once was. Whenever the laws and customs of this race, living among us, yet not us, differ from ours, they are invariably a reversion to an earlier type, and tend in the direction of primitive savagery, a fact which might be cited in support of the theosophical theory that in each incarnation, before the ego has acquired control of his vehicles, the earlier stages of our evolution are hurriedly run through once more. The only right recognized among them is the right of the strongest. The boy who rules their little state is not the best boy, nor the cleverest boy, but the one who can fight best. And their leadership is usually decided by combat, just as it is to this day among many a savage tribe. Their code of morals is distinctly their own, and though it cannot be so directly paralleled among primitive races as some of their other customs, it is decidedly on a lower level than even our own. To oppress and ill-treat the weak, and even torture them to the utmost limit of endurance, seems to be thought a comparatively innocent form of recreation. And it would be only an unusually severe case which would arouse even a passing manifestation of public opinion against the offender. The theft of money is, happily, regarded as contemptible, but the theft of fruit or jam is not, nor, indeed, would the stealing of anything eatable be considered criminal. Falsehood of the most outrageous kind is considered as not only allowable but amusing, when practiced upon some too credulous youngster. If restored to in order to conceal from an adult the misdeeds of a fellow criminal, it is often looked upon as heroic and noble. But the most heinous crime of all, the very lowest abyss of turpitude, is to call in the intervention of a grown-up person to right even the most flagrant wrongs. And many a weak and nervous child endures agonies both physically and mentally from the barbarity of bullies without breathing a word of his sufferings either to parent or teacher, so deep is the distrust with which public opinion amongst boys regards the hostile race of adults. In spite of the terrible suffering which it frequently entails upon the weak and sensitive boy, I am in no way blind to the good side of public school life, to the courage and self-reliance, which it gives to the strong and hardy lad, and the training in the command of the others with which it provides the members of its higher forms. I suppose that England is the only country on earth where the maintenance of order in the small world of school life can be, and is, left practically in the hands of the boys themselves, and there is much in this to be highly commended. But I am at present concerned with the relations between boys as a class and adults as a class, and it can hardly be denied that on the whole these are somewhat strained. The distrust of which I have spoken on the one side being frequently met by dislike and entire want of comprehension on the other. Many a man, or woman, thinks of boys only as noisy, dirty, greedy, clumsy, selfish and generally objectionable. And he never realizes that there may be a good deal of selfishness in this point of view of his, and that if any part of his indictment is true, the fault is not so much in the boys themselves as in the unreasonable way in which they have been brought up. Furthermore, that in any case his duty is not to widen the chasm between them and himself by adopting an attitude of dislike and distrust, but rather to endeavor to improve the position of affairs by judicious kindness and hearty, patient friendliness and sympathy. Surely there is something wrong about such unsatisfactory relations, surely some improvement might be brought about in this unfortunate condition of mutual hostility and mistrust. There are honorable exceptions. There are boys who trust their masters, and masters who trust their boys, and I myself have never found any difficulty in winning the confidence of the juveniles by treating them properly. But in a sadly large number of instances the case is as I have described it. That it need not be so is shown, not only by the exceptions mentioned above, but by the condition of affairs which we find existing in some Oriental lands. I have not yet had the pleasure of visiting the Empire of Japan, but I hear from those who have been there and have made some study of this question, that there is no country in the world where children are so well and so sensibly treated, where their relations with their elders are so completely satisfactory. Harshness, it is said, is entirely unknown, yet the children in no way presume upon the gentleness of the older people. Indeed, no properly treated child ever does or ever would so presume in any country. If he could do so, it would be a clear indication that the adult had failed in his management. All harshness in the treatment of children is a relic of savagery. It may be that when we were at the level of the Stone Age we knew no better, but in these days of supposed enlightenment it is simply criminal. The intentional infliction of pain upon any living creature is one of the most serious of sins, and the karma which follows upon it is of the most appalling character. The suggestion that it is intended to produce a good result is no excuse whatever. In this case, as in all others, it can never be right to do evil that good may come. And that quite apart from the fact that good never does come. Nothing but the most horrible evil results from the common delusion on this subject. The whole thing is an abomination which cries to heaven for a remedy, just as is the ghastly, ceaseless slaughter of animals in order that men may degrade themselves by putting into their bodies a peculiarly unsuitable and objectionable form of food. In both these cases, the ill-treatment of children and the slaughter of animals, we, in England, are in a condition of absolute barbarism. And the men of the future, looking back upon this time, will find it impossible to understand how such utterly horrible practices could coexist with the knowledge of philosophy, ethics, and religion which we possess. Our eyes are blinded to the wickedness of these things by the glamour of custom. But anyone who studies the hidden side of things soon learns that custom is an entirely unreliable guide and that he must face the facts of nature as they are, and not as ignorant people suppose them to be. This almost universal cruelty to children is the reason for the lack of confidence between them and adults. If we treat them as savages we are doing our best to induce them to act as savages. The incompetent parent or teacher pretends that he intentionally injures a child with a view to correcting his faults. If he knew anything of the real facts of life he would be aware that the effect of such injury is in every case far worse than that of the fault which he imagines himself to be trying to correct. His method is so entirely irrational that it seems to the occultist like the crazy inconsequence of a nightmare, all the more so when we think of the vast mass of hatred, hostility, and misunderstanding for which it is responsible. But how, it may be asked, is it proposed that this position of mutual mistrust and misunderstanding should be improved? Well, it is evident that in cases where this breach already exists, it can only be bridged over by unwearying kindness, and by gradual, patient, but constant efforts to promote a better understanding by steadily showing unselfish affection and sympathy. In fact, by habitually putting ourselves in the child's place and trying to realize exactly how all these matters appear to him. If we, who are adults, had not so entirely forgotten our own childish days, we should make far greater allowances for the children of today, and should understand and get on with them much better. This is, however, emphatically one of the cases in which the old proverb holds good, which tells us that prevention is better than cure. If we will but take a little trouble to begin in the right way with our children from the first, we shall easily be able to avoid the undesirable state of affairs which we have been describing. And this is exactly where Theosophy has many a valuable hint to offer to those who are in earnest in wishing to do their duty by the young ones committed to their charge. The duty of parents. The absolute nature of this duty of parents and teachers towards children must first be recognized. It cannot be too strongly or too repeatedly insisted upon that parentage is an exceedingly heavy responsibility of a religious nature, however lightly and thoughtlessly it may often be undertaken. Those who bring a child into the world make themselves directly responsible to the law of karma for the opportunities of evolution which they ought to give to that ego. And heavy indeed will be their penalty if by their carelessness or selfishness they put hindrances in his path, or fail to render him all the help and guidance which he has a right to expect from them. Yet how often the modern parent entirely ignores this obvious responsibility, how often a child is to him nothing but a cause of fatuous vanity or an object of thoughtless neglect. If we want to understand our duty towards the child we must first consider how he came to be what he is, we must trace him back in thought to his previous incarnation. Whatever may have been his outward circumstances at that time, he had a definite disposition of his own, a character containing various more or less developed qualities, some good and some bad. In due course of time that life of his came to an end, but whether that end came slowly by disease or old age, or swiftly by some accident or violence, its advent made no sudden change of any sort in his character. A curious delusion seems to prevail in many quarters that the mere fact of death at once turns a demon into a saint, that, whatever a man's life may have been, the moment he dies he becomes practically an angel of goodness. No idea could possibly be further from the truth, as those whose work lies in trying to help the departed know full well. The casting off of a man's physical body no more alters his disposition than does the casting off of his overcoat. He is precisely the same man the day after his death as he was the day before, with the same vices and the same virtues. True, now that he is functioning only in the astral world he has not the same opportunities of displaying them. But though they may manifest themselves in the astral life in a different manner, they are none the less still there, and the conditions and duration of that life are their result. In that world he must stay until the energy poured forth by his lower desires and emotions during physical life has worn itself out, until the astral body which he has made for himself, disintegrates. For only then can he leave it for the higher and more peaceful realm of the heaven world. But though those particular passions are the time worn out and done with for him, the germs of the qualities in him, which made it possible for them to exist in his nature, are still there. They are latent and ineffective, certainly, because desire of that type requires astral matter for its manifestation. They are what Madame Blavatsky once called privations of matter, but they are quite ready to come into renewed activity, if stimulated, when the man again finds himself under conditions where they can act. An analogy may perhaps, if not pushed too far, be of use in helping us to grasp this idea. If a small bell be made to ring continuously in an airtight vessel, and the air be then gradually withdrawn, the sound will grow fainter and fainter, until it becomes inaudible. The bell is still ringing as vigorously as ever, yet its vibration is no longer manifest to our ears, because the medium by means of which alone it can produce any effect upon them is absent. Admit the air to the vessel, and immediately you hear the sound of the bell once more just as before. Similarly, there are certain qualities in man's nature which need astral matter for their manifestation, just as sound needs either air or some denser matter for its vehicle. And when, in the process of his withdrawal into himself after what we call death, he leaves the astral world for the mental, those qualities can no longer find expression, and must therefore perforce remain latent. But when, centuries later, on his downward course into reincarnation he re-enters the astral realm. These qualities which have remained latent for so long manifest themselves once more, and become the tendencies of the next personality. In the same way there are qualities of the mind which need for their expression the matter of the lower mental levels. And when, after his long rest in the heaven world, the consciousness of the man withdraws into the true ego upon the higher mental levels, these qualities also pass into latency. But when the ego is about to reincarnate, he has to reverse this process of withdrawal, to pass downward through the very same worlds through which he came on his upward journey. When the time of his outflow comes, he puts himself down first onto the lower levels of his own world, and seeks to express himself there, as far as is possible in that less perfect and less plastic matter. In order that he may so express himself and function in that world, he must clothe himself in its matter. Thus the ego aggregates around himself matter of the lower mental levels, the matter which will afterwards become his mind-body. But this matter is not selected at random. Out of all the varied and inexhaustible store around him he attracts to himself just such a combination as is perfectly fitted to give expression to his latent mental qualities. In precisely the same way, when he makes the further descent to the astral world, the matter of that world which is by natural law attracted to him to serve as his vehicle is exactly that which will give expression to the desires which were his at the conclusion of his astral life. In point of fact, he resumes his life in each world just where he left it last time. His qualities are not as yet in any way in action. They are simply the germs of qualities, and for the moment their only influence is to secure for themselves a possible field of manifestation by providing suitable matter for their expression in the various vehicles of the child. Whether they develop once more in this life into the same definite tendencies as in the last one, will depend largely upon the encouragement or otherwise given to them by the surroundings of the child during his early years. Any one of them, good or bad, may be readily stimulated into activity by encouragement, or, on the other hand, may be starved out for lack of that encouragement. If stimulated, it becomes a more powerful factor in the man's life this time than it was in his previous existence. If starved out, it remains merely as an unfructified germ, which presently atrophies and dies out, and does not make its appearance in the succeeding incarnation at all. This, then, is the condition of the child when first he comes under his parents' care. He cannot be said to have as yet a definite mind-body or a definite astral body, but he has around and within him the matter out of which these are to be builded. He possesses tendencies of all sorts, some of them good and some of them evil, and it is in accordance with the development of these tendencies that this building will be regulated. And this development in turn depends almost entirely upon the influences brought to bear upon him from outside during the first few years of his existence. During these years the ego has as yet but little hold over his vehicles, and he looks to the parents to help him to obtain a firmer grasp, and to provide him with suitable conditions, hence their responsibility. The plasticity of childhood. It is impossible to exaggerate the plasticity of these unformed vehicles. We know that the physical body of a child, if only its training be begun at a sufficiently early age, may be modified to a considerable extent. An acrobat, for example, will take a boy of 5 or 6 years old, whose bones and muscles are not yet as hardened and firmly set as ours are, and will gradually accustom his limbs and body to take readily and with comfort all sorts of positions which would be absolutely impossible for most of us now, even with any amount of training. Yet our own bodies at the same age differed in no essential respect from that boy's, and if they had been put through the same exercises they would have become as supple and elastic as his. If the physical body of a child is thus plastic and readily impressible, his astral and mental vehicles are far more so. They thrill in response to every vibration which they encounter, and are eagerly receptive with regard to all influences, whether good or evil, which emanate from those around them. They resemble the physical body also in this other characteristic, that though in early youth they are so susceptible and so easily molded, they soon set and stiffen and acquire definite habits which, when once firmly established, can be altered only with great difficulty. When we realize this, we see at once the extreme importance of the surroundings in which a child passes his earliest years. And the heavy responsibility which rests upon every parent to see that the conditions of the child's development are as good as they can be made. The little creature is as clay in our hands to mold almost as we will. Moment by moment the germs of good or evil quality brought over from the last birth are awakening into activity. Moment by moment are being built up those vehicles which will condition the whole of his afterlife, and it rests with us to awaken the germ of good, to starve out the germ of evil. To a far larger extent than is ever realized by even the fondest parents, the child's future is under their control. Think of all the friends whom you know so well, and try to imagine what splendid specimens of humanity they would be if all their good qualities were enormously intensified. And all the less estimable features absolutely weeded out of their characters. That is the result which it is in your power to produce in your child, if you do your full duty by him. Such a specimen of humanity you may make him if you will but take the trouble. The influence of parents. But how? You will say, by precept. By education. Yes, truly, much may be done in that way when the time comes, but another and far greater power than that is in your hands, a power which you may begin to wield from the very moment of the child's birth, and even before that. And that is the power of the influence of your own life. To some extent this is recognized, for most civilized people are careful of their words and actions in the presence of a child, and it would be an unusually depraved parent who would allow his children to hear him use violent language. Or to see him give way to a fit of passion. But what a man does not realize is that if he wishes to avoid doing the most serious harm to his little ones, he must learn to control not only his words and deeds, but also his thoughts. It is true that you cannot immediately see the pernicious effect of your evil thought or desire upon the mind of your child, but nonetheless it is there, and it is more real and more terrible. More insidious and more far-reaching than the harm which is obvious to the physical eye. If a parent allows himself to cherish feelings of anger or jealousy, of envy or avarice, of selfishness or pride, even though he may never give them outward expression, the waves of emotion which he thereby causes in his own desire body are assuredly acting all the while upon the plastic astral body of his child, tuning its undulations to the same key. Awakening into activity any germs of those sins that may have been brought over from his past life, and setting up in him also the same set of evil habits, which when they have once become definitely formed will be exceedingly difficult to correct. And this is exactly what is being done in the case of most of the children whom we see around us. The aura of a child. As it presents itself to a clairvoyant, the subtle body of a child is often a most beautiful object, pure and bright in its color, free, as yet, from the stains of sensuality and avarice. And from the dull cloud of ill will and selfishness which so frequently darkens all the life of the adult. In it are to be seen lying latent all the germs and tendencies of which we have spoken, some of them evil, some of them good, and thus the possibilities of the child's future life lie plain before the eye of the watcher. But how sad it is to see the change which almost invariably comes over that lovely child aura as the years pass on, to note how persistently the evil tendencies are fostered and strengthened by his environment. And how entirely the good ones are neglected. And so incarnation after incarnation is almost wasted, and a life which, with just a little more care and self-restraint on the part of parents and teachers, might have borne rich fruit of spiritual development, comes practically to nothing. And at its close leaves scarce any harvest to be garnered into the ego of which it has been so one-sided an expression. Carelessness of parents. When one watches the criminal carelessness with which those who are responsible for the bringing up of children allow them to be perpetually surrounded by all kinds of evil and worldly thoughts, one ceases to marvel at the extraordinary slowness of human evolution, and the almost imperceptible progress which is all that the ego has to show for life after life spent in the toil and struggle of this lower world. Yet with so little more trouble so vast an improvement might be introduced. It needs no astral vision to see what a change would come over this weary old world if the majority, or even any large proportion of the next generation, were subjected to the process suggested above if all their evil qualities were steadily repressed and atrophied for lack of nourishment, while all the good in them was assiduously cultivated and developed to the fullest possible extent. One has only to think what they in turn would do for their children, to realize that in 2 or 3 generations all the conditions of life would be different, and a true golden age would have begun. For the world at large age may still be distant, but surely we who are members of the Theosophical Society ought to be doing our best to hasten its advent, and though the influence of our example may not extend far, it is at least within our power to see that our own children have for their development every advantage which we can give them. The greatest care, then, ought to be taken as to the surroundings of children, and people who will persist in thinking coarse and unloving thoughts should at least learn that while they are doing so, they are unfit to come near the young, lest they infect them with a contagion more virulent than fever. Much care is needed, for example, in the selection of the nurses to whom children must sometimes be committed, though it is surely obvious that the less they are left in the hands of servants the better. Nurses often develop the strongest affection for their charges, and treat them as though they were of their own flesh and blood. Yet this is not invariably the case, and, even if it be, the servants are almost inevitably less educated and less refined than their mistresses. A child who is left too much to their companionship is therefore constantly subjected to the impact of thought which is likely to be of a less elevated order than even the average level of that of his parents. So that the mother who wishes her child to grow up into a refined and delicate-minded man should entrust him to the care of others as little as possible, and should, above all things, take good heed to her own thoughts while watching over him. Her great and cardinal rule should be to allow herself to harbor no thought and no desire which she does not wish to see reproduced in her son. Nor is this merely negative conquest over herself sufficient, for, happily, all that has been said about the influence and power of thought is true of good thoughts just as much as of evil ones. And so the parent's duty has a positive as well as a negative side. Not only must they abstain most carefully from fostering, by unworthy or selfish thoughts of their own, any evil tendency which may exist in their child, but it is also their duty to cultivate in themselves strong, unselfish affection, pure thoughts, high and noble aspirations, in order that all these may react upon their charge, quicken whatever of good is already latent in him, and create a tendency towards any good quality which is as yet unrepresented in his character. Nor need they have any fear that such effort on their part will fail in its effect, because they are unable to follow its action for lack of astral vision. To the sight of a clairvoyant the whole transaction is obvious. He distinguishes the waves set up in the mind-body of the parent by the inception of the thought, sees it radiating forth, and notes the sympathetic undulations created by its impingement upon the mind-body of the child. And if he renews his observation at intervals during some considerable period, he discerns the gradual but permanent change produced in that mind-body by the constant repetition of the same stimulus to progress. If the parents themselves possess astral sight, it will, no doubt, be of great assistance to them in showing exactly what are the capabilities of their child, and in what directions he most needs development. But if they have not yet that advantage, there need not therefore be the slightest doubt or question about the result, for that must with mathematical certainty follow sustained effort, whether the process of its working be visible to them or not. With whatever care the parents may surround the child, it cannot but be, if he lives in the world at all, that he will some day encounter influences which will stimulate the germs of evil in his composition. But it makes all the difference in the world which germs are stimulated first. Usually the evil is thoroughly awakened into activity before the ego has any hold upon the vehicles, and so when he does grasp them he finds that he has to combat a strong predisposition to various evils. When the germs of good are tardily aroused they have to struggle to assert themselves against a set of inharmonious thought wave which are already firmly established, and often they do not succeed. If, however, by exceeding care before birth and for several years after it the parents are fortunate enough to be able to excite only the good undulations, as the ego gains control he finds it naturally easy to express himself along those lines. And a decided habit is set up in that direction. Then when the evil excitation comes, as come it surely will some time or other, it finds a strong momentum in the direction of good, which it strives in vain to overcome. The command of the ego over this lower vehicles is often but small, unless he is unusually advanced. But his will is always for good, because his desire in connection with these vehicles is to evolve himself by their means, and such power as he is able to throw into the balance is therefore always on the right side. But with his at present somewhat uncertain grasp upon his astral and mental bodies, he is frequently unable to overcome a strong tendency in the direction of evil when that has been already established. If, however, he finds the strong tendency set up in the opposite direction, he is enabled thereby to get hold of his vehicles more effectually. And after he has done that, the evil suggestion which comes later can only with difficulty succeed in obtaining an entrance. In the one case there is in the personality a taste for evil, a readiness to receive it and indulge in it. In the other there is a strong natural distaste for evil which makes the work of the ego much easier. Not only should a parent watch his thoughts, but his moods also. A child is quick to notice and to resent injustice. And if he finds himself scolded at one time for an action which on another occasion caused only amusement, what wonder that his sense of the invariability of nature's laws is outraged. Again, when trouble or sorrow comes upon the parent, as in this world it sometimes must, it is surely his duty to try, as far as possible, to prevent his load of grief from weighing upon his children as well as upon himself. At least when in their presence he should make a special effort to be cheerful and resigned, lest the dull, leaden hue of depression should extend itself from his astral body to theirs. Many a well-meaning parent has an anxious and fussy nature, is always fidgeting about trifles, and worrying his children and himself about matters which are really quite unimportant. If he could but observe clairvoyantly the utter unrest and disquiet which he thus produces in his own higher bodies, and could further see how these disturbed waves introduce quite unnecessary agitation and irritation into the susceptible vehicles of his children, he would no longer be surprised at their occasional outbursts of petulance or nervous excitability, and would realize that in such a case he is often far more to blame than they. What he should contemplate and set before him as his object, is a restful, unruffled spirit, the peace which passeth all understanding, the perfect calm which comes from the confidence that all will at last be well. Above all things must he strive to become an embodiment of the divine love, so that he may fully realize it in his own life, in order that he may flood with it the life of his child. The body must live in an atmosphere of love. He ought never to meet with a jarring vibration, never even to know in his young days that there is anything but love in this world. And when the time comes, as come it unhappily must, when he learns that in the outside world love is often sadly lacking, all the more let him feel that his home will never fail him, that there, at least, he may always count upon the uttermost love, the fullest comprehension. It is obvious that the training of the parent's character which is necessitated by these considerations is in every respect a splendid one. And that in thus helping on the evolution of their children they also benefit themselves to an extent which is absolutely incalculable. For the thoughts which at first have been summoned by conscious effort for the sake of the child will soon become natural and habitual, and will, in time, form the background of the parent's entire life. It must not be supposed that these precautions may be relaxed as the child grows older, for though this extraordinary sensitiveness to the influence of his surroundings commences as soon as the ego descends upon the embryo, long before birth takes place, it continues, in most cases, up to about the period of maturity. If such influences as are above suggested have been brought to bear upon him during infancy and childhood, the body of 12 or 14 will be far better equipped for the efforts which lie before him than his less fortunate companions, with whom no special trouble has been taken. But he is still far more impressionable than an adult, he still needs to be surrounded by the same boundless sea of never-failing love. The same strong help and guidance upon the mental level must still be continued, in order that the good habits both of thought and of action may not yield before the newer temptations which are likely to assail him. Although in his earlier years it was naturally chiefly to his parents that he had to look for such assistance, all that has been said of their duties applies equally to anyone who comes into contact with children in any capacity, and most especially to those who undertake the tremendous responsibilities of the teacher. This influence of a master for good or for evil over his pupils is one that cannot readily be measured, and, exactly as before, it depends not only upon what he says or what he does, but even more upon what he thinks. Many a master repeatedly reproves in his boys the exhibition of tendencies for the creation of which he is himself directly responsible. If his thought is selfish or impure, then he will find selfishness and impurity reflected all around him, nor does the evil caused by such a thought end with those whom it immediately affects. The young minds upon which it is reflected take it up and magnify and strengthen it, and thus it reacts upon others in turn and becomes an unholy tradition handed down from one generation of boys to another. And so stamps its peculiar character upon a particular school or a particular class. Happily, a good tradition may be set up almost as easily as a bad one, not quite as easily, because there are always undesirable external influences to be taken into account. But still a teacher who realizes his responsibilities and manages his school upon the principles that have been suggested will soon find that his self-control and self-devotion have not been fruitless. The necessity for love. There is only one way in which either parent or teacher can really obtain effective influence over a child and draw out all the best that is in him, and that is by enfolding him in the pure fire of a warm, constant, personal love, and thereby winning his love and confidence in return. More than any other qualification is this insisted upon in Alcyone's wonderful book Education as Service, a book which every parent and teacher should read, for the sake of the sweet spirit which it breathes, and the valuable hints which it contains. It is true that obedience may be extorted and discipline preserved by inspiring fear, but rules enforced by such a method are kept only so long as he who imposes them, or some one representing him, is present, and are invariably broken when there is no fear of detection. The child keeps them because he must, and not because he wishes to do so, and meantime the effect upon his character is of the most disastrous description. If, on the other hand, his affection has been invoked, his will at once ranges itself on the side of the rule. He wishes to keep it, because he knows that in breaking it he would cause sorrow to one whom he loves. And if only this feeling be strong enough, it will enable him to rise superior to all temptation, and the rule will be binding, no matter who may be present or absent. Thus the object is attained not only much more thoroughly, but also much more easily and pleasantly both for teacher and pupil, and all the best side of the child's nature is called into activity, instead of all the worst. Instead of rousing the child's will into sullen and persistent opposition, the teacher arrays it on his own side in the contest against distractions or temptations. The danger of deceit and secretiveness is avoided, and thus results are achieved which could never be approached on the other system. It is of the utmost importance always to try to understand the child, and to make him feel certain that he has one foot's friendliness and sympathy. All appearance of harshness must be carefully avoided, and the reason of all instructions given to him should always be fully explained. It must indeed be made clear to him that sometimes sudden emergencies arise in which the older person has no time to explain his instructions, and he should understand that in such a case he should obey, even though he may not fully comprehend. But even then the explanation should be always given afterwards. Unwise parents or teachers often make the mistake of habitually exacting obedience without understanding, a most unreasonable demand. Indeed, they expect from the child at all times and under all conditions an angelic patience and saintliness which they are far indeed from possessing themselves. They have not yet realized that harshness towards a child is always not only wicked, but absolutely unreasonable and foolish as well, since it can never be the most effective way of obtaining from him what is desired. A child's faults are often the direct results of the unnatural way in which he is treated. Sensitive and nervous to a degree, he constantly finds himself misunderstood and scolded or ill-treated for offenses whose turpitude he does not in the least comprehend. Is it wonderful that, when the whole atmosphere about him reeks with the deceit and falsehood of his elders, his fears should sometimes drive him into untruthfulness also? In such a case the karma of the sin will fall most heavily upon those who by their criminal harshness have placed a weak and undeveloped being in a position where it was almost impossible for him to avoid it. If we expect truth from our children, we must first of all practice it ourselves. We must think truth as well as speak truth and act truth, before we can hope to be strong enough to save them from the sea of falsehood and deceit which surrounds us on every side. But if we treat them as reasonable beings, if we explain fully and patiently what we want from them, and show them that they have nothing to fear from us, because perfect love casteth out fear, then we shall find no difficulty about truthfulness. A curious but not uncommon delusion, a relic, perhaps, of the terrible days when, for its sins, this unhappy country of England groaned under the ghastly tyranny of Puritanism is, that children can never be good unless they are unhappy. That they must be thwarted at every turn, and never by any chance allowed to have their own way in anything, because when they are enjoying themselves they must necessarily be in a condition of desperate wickedness. Absurd and atrocious as this doctrine is, various modifications of it are still widely prevalent, and it is responsible for a vast amount of cruelty and unnecessary misery, wantonly inflicted upon little creatures whose only crime is that they are natural and happy. Undoubtedly nature intends that childhood shall be a happy time, and we ought to spare no efforts to make it so, for in that respect, as in all others, if we thwart nature we do so at our peril. A hymn tells us, God would have us happy, happy all the day, and in this case as in all others it is our duty and our privilege to be fellow workers together with Him. It will help us much in our dealings with children if we remember that they also are egos, that their small and feeble physical bodies are but the accident of the moment, and that in reality we are all about the same age. So that we owe them respect as well as affection, and we must not expect to impose our will or individuality upon theirs. Our business in training them is to develop only that in their lower vehicles which will cooperate with the ego, which will make them better channels for the ego to work through. Long ago, in the golden age of the old Atlantean civilization, the importance of the office of the teacher of the children was so fully recognized that none was permitted to hold it except a trained clairvoyant, who could see all the latent qualities and capabilities of his charges, and could, therefore, work intelligently with each, so as to develop what was good in him and to amend what was evil. In the distant future of the sixth root race that will be so once more, but that time is, as yet, far away, and we have to do our best under less favorable conditions. Yet unselfish affection is a wonderful quickener of the intuition, and those who really love their children will rarely be at a loss to comprehend their needs. And keen and persistent observation will give them, though at the cost of much more trouble, some approach to the clearer insight of their Atlantean predecessors. At any rate, it is well worth the trying, for when once we realize our true responsibility in relation to children we shall assuredly think no labor too great which enables us to discharge it better. Love is not always wise, we know. But at least it is wiser than carelessness, and parents and teachers who truly love will be thereby spurred on to gain wisdom for the sake of the children. Religious training. Many members of our society, while feeling that their children need something to take the place filled in ordinary education by the religious training, have yet found it almost impossible so to put theosophy before them as to make it in any way intelligible to them. Some have even permitted their children to go through the ordinary routine of Bible lessons, saying that they did not know what else to do, and that though much of the teaching was obviously untrue it could be corrected afterwards. This course is entirely indefensible. No child should ever waste his time in learning what he will have to unlearn afterwards. If the true inner meaning of Christianity can be taught to our children, that indeed is well, because that is pure theosophy, but unfortunately that is not the form which religious instruction takes in ordinary schools. There is no real difficulty in putting the grand truths of theosophy intelligibly before the minds of our children. It is useless to trouble them with rounds and races, with muloprocrity and planetary chains. But then, however interesting and valuable all this information may be, it is of little importance in the practical regulation of conduct, whereas the great ethical truths upon which the whole system rests can, happily, be made clear even to the childish understanding. What could be simpler in essence than the three great truths which are given to Sensa in the Idyll of the White Lotus? The soul of man is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor have no limit. The principle which gives life dwells in us and without us, is undying and eternally beneficent, is not heard, nor seen, nor smelt, but is perceived by the man who desires perception. Each man is his own absolute lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to himself, the decreer of his life, his reward, his punishment. These truths, which are as great as is life itself, are as simple as the simplest mind of man. Feed the hungry with them. We might express these more tersely by saying, man is immortal, God is good, as we sow, so shall we reap. Surely none of our children can fail to grasp these simple ideas in their broad outline, though as they grow older they may spend many a year in learning more and more of the immensity of their full meaning. Teach them the grand old formula that death is the gate of life, not a terrible fate to be feared, but simply a stage of progress to be welcomed with interest. Teach them to live, not for themselves, but for others, to go through the world as friends and helpers, earnest in loving reverence and care for all living things. Teach them to delight in seeing and in causing happiness in others, in animals and birds as well as in human beings. Teach them that to cause pain to any living thing is always a wicked action, and can never have aught of interest or amusement for any right-thinking or civilized man. A child's sympathies are so easily roused, and his delight in doing something is so great, that he responds at once to the idea that he should try to help, and should never harm, all the creatures around him. He should be taught to be observant, that he may see where help is needed, whether by man or by animal, and promptly to supply the want so far as lies in his power. A child likes to be loved, and he likes to protect, and both these feelings may be utilized in training him to be a friend of all creatures. He will readily learn to admire flowers as they grow, and not wish to pluck them heedlessly, casting them aside a few minutes later to wither on the roadside. Those which he plucks he will pick carefully, avoiding injury to the plant. He will preserve and tend them, and his way through wood and field will never be traceable by fading blossoms and uprooted plants. Physical training. The physical training of the child is a matter of the greatest importance, for a strong, pure, healthy body is necessary for the full expression of the developing soul within. Teach him from the first the exceeding importance of physical purity, so that he may regard his daily bath as just as much an integral part of his life as his daily food. See to it that his body is never befouled with such filthy abominations of modern savagery as meat, alcohol or tobacco. See to it that he has always plenty of sunlight, of fresh air and of exercise. We have seen in an earlier chapter how horrible are the surroundings in a great town, and if these are evil in their influence on adults, they are 10 times worse for the more sensitive children. The truth is that no children ought ever to be brought up in a town at all, and those whose evil karma compels them to work in such places should at least try if possible to live a little way outside of them for the sake of their children. It is far better for the children to be brought up in the country, even though it be in comparative poverty, than that, in order to amass money for them, the parents should allow them to grow up amidst all the noxious influences of a large town. Where the urban life is unfortunately unavoidable, they should at least be taken out of the city as often as possible, and kept out as long as possible. So shall your child grow up pure, healthy, and happy. So shall you provide, for the soul entrusted to your care, a casket of which it need not be ashamed. A vehicle through which it shall receive only the highest and best that the physical world can give, which it can use as a fitting instrument for the noblest and the holiest work. As the parent teaches the child, he will also be obliged to set the example in this as in other things, and so the child will thus again civilize his elders as well as improve himself. Birds and butterflies, cats and dogs, all will be his friends, and he will delight in their beauty instead of longing to chase or destroy them. Children thus trained will grow up into men and women who recognize their place in evolution and their work in the world, and each will serve as a fresh center of humanizing force, gradually changing the direction of human influence on all lower things. If thus we train our children, if we are thus careful in our relations with them, we shall bear nobly our great responsibility, and in so doing we shall help on the grand work of evolution. We shall be doing our duty, not only to our children, but to the human race, not only to these particular egos, but to the many millions yet to come. Chapter 23. By our relation to lower kingdoms. Domestic animals. We have a responsibility which must not be forgotten towards the animals which we draw around us. This may be of 2 kinds, or rather of 2 degrees. A farmer in the course of his business has to deal with a large number of animals which may be described as semi-domesticated. His duty towards them is clearly to feed them well and to take all possible care to keep them in perfect health. He may sometimes attach to himself some one of these, but on the whole his relation towards them is in the mass only, and as they are yet far from the possibility of individualization, it is not likely that his influence over them can go far, or be more than a general one. His relation with them is, in fact, a business relation, though he should look after them as carefully as though they were human. The case is quite different with the really domestic animals which live in the house with us, and come into intimate personal relations with us. No one is obliged to keep a dog or a cat, but if he does so he incurs a much greater responsibility towards that animal than the farmer has towards any member of his flock. It would be unpardonable selfishness for anyone who keeps such an animal to think only of his own pleasure in connection with it, and not of the animal's development. The domestic animal is in fact a kind of younger child, with this difference, that whereas the child is already an ego and has to be helped to control his new vehicles, the animal is not yet a separate ego and has to be helped to become one. The process of the individualization of an animal has been often described. Notes upon it may be found in a textbook of Theosophy, The Inner Life, Man Visible and Invisible and the Christian Creed. A perusal of what is there written will show at once along what line our duties to the animals lie. We must endeavor to develop their affection and their intellect, and the principal factor in both those developments is the affection which we feel for them. I have written at considerable length, in The Inner Life, Volume 2, upon mistakes which are frequently made by men in their relation to domestic animals. All those mistakes are due to a selfish attitude with regard to the animal, an endeavor to employ him for the gratification of our own evil passions, as, for example, when a dog is trained to hunt, and made in that way to do vastly more harm than his forefathers ever did as wild beasts in the jungle. For the wild beast kills only for food, when impelled to do so by hunger, but the dog is trained to kill for the pleasure of killing, and is thereby degraded in the scale of evolution instead of being raised. Between the two categories, of really domestic animals and farm animals, we may place the horse, for it comes into more individual relation with the rider than does the farm animal. And yet at the same time it is far from possessing the intelligence of the dog or the cat. It also must be treated intelligently, and above all with unvarying kindness. The rider should remember always that the horse does not exist solely to serve him, but has an evolution of its own which it is his duty to forward. There is no wrong in his utilizing it to help him, because the association with him may develop its affection and intelligence. But he must treat it always as he would treat a human servant, and never forget its interest while he is making it serve his own. Birds. A student of the hidden side of life cannot but deprecate the practice of keeping birds in cages. Perfect liberty and the sense of great open spaces are of the very essence of the life of a bird, and his misery at being imprisoned is often intense and most pathetic. This is always especially marked in the case of those birds which are natives of the country, and all such ought certainly at once to be set free. Foreign birds, which can live happily only in other climates, come under a different category. They also spend most of the time in memories of splendid tropical scenes, and in longing for the home from which they have been taken, to which they ought to be sent back at the earliest possible moment. The sin there lies with those who originally caught them, and those who keep them now share in it only so far as that their action makes it profitable. A student who has already thoughtlessly acquired such birds as these, can hardly do other than keep them, unless he is in a position to return them to their native country. But he should provide them with the largest cages, and let them out of them to fly about the room as often as possible, while he certainly should not encourage a nefarious traffic by buying any more of such creatures. The only rational and useful relation that we can establish with birds is that which occasionally exists in country places, that food is regularly put out for the birds in a certain place and they come and take it, while remaining otherwise perfectly free. If a man wants to keep a bird, he should keep it precisely as he would keep a cat, provide it with plenty of food and an abiding place whenever it chooses to accept it, but leave it otherwise free to go where it will. The difficulty in the way is that the bird's intelligence is so much less developed than the cat's that it would be more difficult to get it to understand the conditions of the arrangement. By far the best plan is to have nothing to do with foreign birds, but to try to make friends of the wild birds of the neighborhood. Individualization is not a possibility, as the bird is not developing along our line. When it transcends the bird evolution it passes directly into one of the higher orders of nature spirits. Nevertheless, kindness shown to birds arouses gratitude and affection in them, and helps them forward in their evolution. Plants. Another direction in which we may exercise a good deal of influence if we will, is upon the plants in our gardens. Plants, like animals, are quick to respond to wise and loving care, and are distinctly affected not only by what we do for them physically, but also by our feelings towards them. Anyone who possesses astral sight will be aware that flowers delight in and respond to a feeling of admiration. The feelings of the vegetable differ rather in degree than in kind from those of the animal or of the human being, and they bear somewhat the same relation to those of the animal as do those of the animal to those of the human being. The animal is less complex in his emotions than the human being, but he is capable of affection and hatred, of fear and pride, of jealousy or of shame. Some animals, too, seem to have a sense of humor. At any rate, they keenly enjoy playing tricks on one another, and they object greatly to being made to appear ridiculous or to being laughed at. There is nothing to show that these emotions are less in proportion in the animal than they are in us. But we may say that the animal has fewer emotions and that they are less complex, and his methods of expressing them are more limited. If we descend to the vegetable kingdom we find that the vegetable has scarcely any power of expression. But we shall be making a grave mistake if we therefore assume that there are no feelings to express. Emotion in the vegetable kingdom is again far less complex even than that of the animal, and it is altogether vaguer, a sort of blind instinctual feeling. The chief physical manifestation of it is the well-known fact that some people are always fortunate with plants, while others are always unfortunate, even when the physical measures adopted are precisely the same. This difference exists everywhere, but in India it has been specially noted, and certain people are described as having the lucky hand, and it is recognized that almost anything which those people plant will grow. Even under quite unfavorable conditions, and that anything which they cultivate is sure to turn out well. When this influence is universal over the vegetable kingdom it is not a question of individual liking, but of certain characteristics in the person, and certain qualities in his astral and etheric vehicles which prove generally attractive. Just as there are some people with whom all dogs will at once make friends, and others who without effort can manage the most recalcitrant horses. But plants are also capable of individual attachment, and when they get to know people well, they are pleased to see, or rather to feel, them near. A person who pours upon his flowers a stream of admiration and affection evokes in them a feeling of pleasure, first of a general pleasure in receiving admiration, which might be thought of as a sort of germ of pride, and then, secondly, a feeling of pleasure at the presence of the person who admires, which in the same way is the germ of love and gratitude. Plants are also capable of anger and dislike, though outwardly they have hardly any means of showing them. An occultist who has a garden will make a point of seeing that it is in every way perfectly and carefully looked after, and more than this, he will himself make friends with the flowers and trees and shrubs. And will go sometimes to visit them and give each its due meed of admiration, and so in giving pleasure to these lowly organisms he will himself be surrounded by a vague feeling of affection. It may be said that the feeling of a vegetable can hardly be strong enough to be worth taking into account. It is true that the influence exerted by it upon a human being is less than would be produced by the feeling of an animal. But these influences do exist, and though the feeling of one plant may not seem important, the feeling of hundreds begins to be a recognizable factor, and if we wish to make the best possible conditions, we must not ignore our less developed brethren of the lower kingdoms. That much even from the purely selfish point of view, but the occultist naturally thinks first of the effect upon the plant. When we form a garden we are drawing round us a number of members of the vegetable kingdom for our own pleasure. But at the same time this affords us an opportunity of helping them in their evolution, an opportunity which should not be neglected. Plants differ much in their power to receive and respond to human influences. A large tree, for example, with its slow growth and its long life, is capable of forming a far stronger attachment than anything which is merely annual. Such a tree comes to have a decided personality of its own, and is even sometimes able temporarily to externalize that personality, so that it can be seen by the clairvoyant. In such a case it usually takes upon itself human form for the time, as I have mentioned in The Inner Life, Volume 2. Those who wish to understand how much more intelligence there is in the vegetable kingdom than we usually think, should read a delightful book called The Sagacity and Morality of Plants by J. E. Taylor. Nature Spirits. This wonderful evolution has been described in an earlier chapter, but from the point of view of its effect upon us, rather than of ours upon it. Here we must consider the outer side of that relation, the influence which we may exercise upon the nature spirits of our neighborhood, and the friendship which we may make with them. Many of their tribes are so beautiful and so interesting that their acquaintance would repay cultivation, and we may help to develop their intellect and affection, and so do them much good. Those of them who possess etheric bodies have the power to make themselves physically visible if they choose, so men who are happy enough to gain their friendship may occasionally be rewarded by a view of them even with ordinary sight. There is also a probability that such friends may be helped by these elves to attain flashes of temporary clairvoyance, in order that in that way they may see them. A fairy has many points of resemblance to a wild animal, and the method of making friends with him is much what we should have to adopt if we were trying to tame birds or deer. He is shy and distrustful towards man. How is this distrust to be overcome? One who wishes to study at first hand the habits of a bird usually goes to the haunt of the creature, conceals himself, and remains perfectly quiet, in the hope that the bird will not see him, or if it does, will be reassured by his absolute stillness. The etheric sight of a nature spirit pierces through walls or bushes, so it is hopeless to attempt to evade his observation, and for him the stillness which is important is not that of the physical body, but of the astral. He objects to the filthy physical emanations of the average man, of meat, of tobacco, of alcohol, and of general uncleanliness. Obviously one who wishes to make friends with him must be free from all these. He objects, too, to storms of passion and impurity, so the man who seeks him must also be free from all low and selfish feelings, such as lust, anger, envy, jealousy, avarice, or depression. These negative qualifications being in order, can anything positive be done to invite the approach of so coy a visitor? Animals can often be attracted by the offer of food, but as a fairy does not eat, that particular allurement is not available in his case. The student can provide for him conditions which he is known to enjoy. Strong unselfish affection or devotion, or indeed any high feeling which burns steadily and without wild surgings, creates an atmosphere in which the nature spirit delights to bathe. The man, the right sort of man who rests for a while in some lovely, lonely spot, in a wood perhaps, or by a stream or a waterfall and revels in such thoughts as have been suggested, is quite likely to become aware of an unfamiliar presence. Of something fascinating, yet strange and non-human. And perchance, if fortune greatly favors him, he may even see as well as feel, when the shy, wild creature becomes a little more accustomed to him, and gradually learns to trust and like him. But if the student remembers that to the nature spirit this is an adventure such as it would be for a mouse to make friends with a cat, or for a man to endeavor to establish fraternal relations with a tiger in the jungle, he will learn to exercise unlimited patience, and not to expect immediate results. Almost all nature spirits delight in music, and some are specially attracted by certain melodies. So if the experimenter happens to be a performer upon some portable instrument, such as the flute, it may increase his chances of success if he plays upon it. I knew an elf in Italy who was so fascinated by a particular piece of music that when it was played on the piano, he would actually leave the wood in which he dwelt and come into the drawing room to enjoy it and dance to it, or rather to bathe in its sound waves, to pulsate and sway in harmony with them. But I never knew him to do this if there were more than 2 or 3 people in the room, and even those must be friends whom he had learned to trust. More than once I have seen a shepherd boy in Sicily, sitting in some lonely spot on the hillside, playing on his homemade double panpipe like an ancient Greek. with an appreciative audience of fairies frisking round him of which he was probably blissfully unconscious, though no doubt their delight reacted upon him and added zest to his playing. Sometimes the peasants do see the nature spirits, however, plenty of instances may be found in Mr. Wendt's fairy faith in Celtic countries. Inanimate surroundings. We are all the while exerting an influence even on what we commonly consider our inanimate surroundings. Some of these, by the way, are not quite so inanimate as we are apt to think. We all know that the divine life exists in the mineral kingdom as well as in those which are higher, and in that sense rocks, stones, and minerals may rightly be thought of as alive. But certain objects have a more vivid and special kind of life, the study of which is of great interest. To explain it we must revert for a moment to a familiar analogy. We know how the life of the elemental essence of the astral body gathers itself up into a kind of personality, which we call the desire elemental, and exists for the time as a separate being with definite desires and dislikes of its own, and with sufficient power to exercise a great effect in the course of its life on the man whose vehicle it informs. We know that the similar consciousness animating the cells of the physical body, including of course its etheric part, manifests itself in certain instinctive movements. In a way analogous to this, the consciousness which animates the molecules of certain minerals will combine into a temporary whole when those molecules are welded together into a definite form. And especially is this the case when that form demands the presence and attention of man, as machinery does. A ship. The most perfect example of what I mean is to be found in a ship, for there we have a structure built of an enormous number of component parts, and usually of different substances. Kipling's story of the ship that found herself is not mere fiction, but has a real and important truth behind it. When a ship is first built she is not thus conscious of herself as a unit, but is a mere aggregation of a number of separate sentiences. But the whole fabric does become in time a unit of consciousness or awareness, being to a certain extent aware of itself as a whole, however dim and vague its percipience may be as compared with our own. And that consciousness has what we can hardly describe as otherwise than feelings, indistinct though they are as compared with anything to which we usually give that name. Such an obscure semi-entity certainly may, and often does, like one person better than another, so that one person can do with it what another cannot. This in no way modifies the other fact that some men are better seamen than others, and with a little practice can get out of any ship the best that is to be got. Just so, some men are splendid riders, and can almost immediately establish a friendly understanding with any horse. But quite apart from that, a horse may become attached to a certain man, and learn to understand his wishes far more readily than a stranger. The same thing is true of the vaguer consciousness of the ship. I do not wish to be understood as suggesting by this term anything comparable, in definiteness or responsiveness, to the consciousness in man, but there certainly is a something, however loose and uncertain, which we cannot define by any other word. Machines. The same thing is true of a railway engine, of a motor car or a bicycle. Just as the driver or rider becomes accustomed to his machine and learns to know exactly what it will do, and to humor its various little tricks, so the machine in its turn becomes used to the driver and will do more for him in various ways than for a stranger. The same must be true of many other sorts of machinery, though for that I have not had the benefit of personal observation. Apart from the influence acquired by an individual over the blended consciousness of a machine, the mere blending itself produces an effect upon the molecules of the substance of which it is made. Iron which has formed part of a machine, and so has experienced what is for it this exaltation of consciousness, may be thought of as somewhat more developed than iron which has not been used in the building of a self-contained system. It has become capable of responding to additional and more complicated vibrations, and that for a mineral is evolution. It is more awake than other iron. This condition of greater vitality would be easily visible to a clairvoyant who had learnt its indications, but I do not know of any method by which it could be observed physically. The additional power of response is not always of the same kind, and variants of it may be aroused in different ways. Wrought iron, for example, is much more alive than cast iron, and this result is produced by the frequent blows which it receives in the process of its working. The same thing may be observed to a greater degree with a horseshoe, for not only has that been wrought in the first place, but it has been subjected to constant striking upon the road when it was worn by the horse. This long-continued process has awakened it in a certain way which makes it exceedingly repulsive to some of the lowest and most malignant types of the astral and etheric entities. And that is the reason for the old superstition, that when hung over the door it kept away evil and brought good fortune to its possessor. Another interesting point with regard to this curious composite consciousness is that after a certain time it gets tired, a fact which has frequently been observed by those who have much to do with machinery. After a certain time a machine, though perfectly in order, gets into a condition in which it will not work properly, but becomes slack in its action. It often seems impossible to do anything to cure it, but if it is left alone for a time it presently recovers its tone and will go on working as before. Metals show plainly that they are subject to fatigue. A steel pen will sometimes scratch and write badly when it has been used continually for several hours, but the clerk who understands nature so far, will put the pen aside, instead of throwing it away. And maybe the next day will find it even better than it was at first. A barber often finds his razor refusing to take a keen edge, and it is quite customary for him to say that it is getting tired, and to put it aside to rest. Some days later that same razor will be in perfect order, keen and sharp as ever. Railway engines are known to want regular rest, and after a certain amount of work are put into the shed, and allowed to cool, and so the engine has its rest just as regularly a human being. So we see that fatigue is one of the conditions possible to the mineral kingdom and may be felt by metals as well as by men in their physical bodies. See Response in the Living and Non-Living, by Professor J.C. Bose. As a matter of fact, fatigue is not felt anywhere except in the physical world. There are men, but so far I know only few, who are unusually charged with electricity, and thus produce a special effect upon any metal with which they habitually come into contact. It is said, for example, that such people cause quite considerable deflections of a ship's compass when they come near it, but this is physical, and hardly occult. Unlucky ships. A curious instance of the intervention of the hidden side in the ordinary affairs of life is furnished by the experience of practical men connected with such matters. That certain ships or engines are what is called unlucky, that accident after accident occurs in connection with them, without any obvious negligence to account for it. Naturally some machines are better made than others, some men are more careful than others, but I am not referring to cases into which either of these factors enters. In some cases where two ships or two engines are precisely similar, and the men who manage them are of equal capacity, one proves always fortunate, or meets with only an average proportion of accidents, while the other is perpetually in trouble for no obvious reason. There is no question at all that this is so, and it offers an interesting problem to the occult student. I am inclined to think that various reasons may sometimes come into play in producing the results. In one such case at least it appeared to be due to feelings of intense hatred nourished by all the men against the first captain of the vessel, who seems to have been a petty tyrant of the most objectionable description. A large number of men continually cursed the captain, the ship, and all that belonged to her, with all the will power at their command, and the state of their feeling produced this evil result, that disaster after disaster overtook her. By the time that captain was removed, the ship had acquired a definite reputation of being unlucky, and so her successive crews have surrounded her with thought forms to that effect, which naturally enough justify themselves by continuing the series of misfortunes. In other cases I think that ill feeling directed towards the builder of the vessel has produced similar results. I doubt whether any such directions of evil force would in themselves be sufficient actually to cause serious misfortune. But in the life of every ship there are a great many occasions on which an accident is only just averted by vigilance and promptitude, in which a single moment's delay or slackness would be sufficient to precipitate a catastrophe. Such a mass of thought forms as I have described would be amply sufficient to cause that momentary lack of vigilance or that momentary hesitation, and that would be the easiest line along which its malignity could work. Stone used in building. In speaking of our houses I have already mentioned the effect which we are constantly producing upon the walls which surround us and the articles of furniture in our rooms. It obviously follows that stone which has been used for a building is never afterwards in the same condition as the stone which is as yet unquarried. It has been permeated, probably for many years in succession, with influences of a certain kind, and that means that forever after it is capable of responding to such influences more readily than is the unused stone. We are therefore actually assisting in the evolution of the mineral kingdom when we use these various materials for our buildings. I have already explained how the different influences which we put into them react upon us. So that just as a church radiates devotion, and a prison radiates gloom, so each house in the business part of a city radiates anxiety and effort, too often coupled also with weariness and despair. There are instances in which a knowledge of these facts may prove useful in the prosaic matters of physical life. Essay sickness. We know, for example, that many sensitive ladies are often seized with the pangs of sickness as soon as they go on board a vessel, even though the sea may be perfectly smooth and there may be no physical excuse for the sensation. No doubt this is partially autosuggestion, but most of it comes from outside. Many a cabin is so thoroughly loaded with this suggestion that it requires considerable mental force for a newcomer to resist it. So it is not only the physical consideration of fresh air which makes it desirable for anyone who is likely to suffer in this way to be on deck as much as possible. Fifth section. Conclusion. Chapter 24. The results of the knowledge. A summary. To know something of the hidden side of nature makes life far more interesting for us. Interesting most of all, naturally, to the clairvoyant who can see it, or to the sensitive who can feel it, but interesting in a less degree even to those who cannot directly see or feel, and equally important to all. Because all are influencing and being influenced, even though it be unconsciously to themselves so far as their physical brain is concerned. In each case, as we have considered it, I have tried to indicate the lesson to be learned from it, but I will summarize the results here. First and foremost we learn the duty of happiness, the necessity of casting away from us depression and sorrow, even under the circumstances which most readily produce it in those who do not know. Yet at the same time we learn that life must be taken seriously, and must be lived not for selfish enjoyment but for the helping of our fellow men. We see that we must be on our guard against unsuspected influences, such, for example, as the prejudices connected with race, religion, or class, and the weight of public opinion, never allowing these to bias our judgment. But trying always to arrive at the truth and to weigh the facts for ourselves. That we must not yield ourselves unquestioningly even to presumed spiritual inspiration, but in that case also must try the spirits and use our common sense. We learn desirability of systematic work or training. The futility of taking offense, of becoming angry, or of allowing our serenity to be disturbed in any way whatever, and the necessity of maintaining a ceaseless watch over our thoughts as well as our words and actions. Lest they should draw around us unpleasant influences and act as temptations to our neighbors. And we see that from those influences which we have mentioned above and from all others which are undesirable, we can readily protect ourselves by the formation of shells, though a better protection still is to be so full of the divine love that it is always pouring itself out from us in the shape of love to our fellow men. We learn the danger of becoming slaves to the alcohol, corpse-eating or tobacco habits. We learn to keep ourselves free from participation in the cruelties so-called sport. We realize that we must be careful of the situation and the decoration of our houses or rooms, avoiding harmful influences and taking care always to flood them with sunlight and fresh air. That our clothing should be dictated by considerations of health and common sense, and not merely by fashion. That those who have the good fortune to be specially in contact with children, should treat them with the uttermost love, gentleness, and patience. That we should recognize the brotherhood of all forms of the divine life in our treatment of animals and plants. That we should never work unnecessary destruction upon anything, whether it be what we call animate or inanimate, since the occultist knows the divine life in everything, and respects it. That what we are, what we think and what we do are even more important in relation to their action upon others than upon ourselves. That we must preserve the uttermost truth in thought and speech, and utter no word that is not true, kind, pleasant and helpful, that every man possesses a certain amount of force and is responsible for making the best use of it. We learn that ignorance of the law is not accepted by nature as an excuse, because it does not alter the effect of what we do, that evil is but the dark shadow of good, and is always temporary, while good is eternal. And that while, in everything human, good and evil are mixed, yet the powers behind always use to the utmost the good in everything and everybody. These points on which I have written are but specimens of a vast host, for to everything there is an unseen side, and to live the life of the occultist is to study this higher, hidden side of nature, and then intelligently to adapt oneself to it. The occultist looks at the whole of each subject which is brought before him, instead of only at the lowest and least important part of it, and then orders his action according to what he sees, in obedience to the dictates of plain common sense, and to the law of love which guides the universe. Those therefore who would study and practice occultism must develop within themselves these three priceless possessions: knowledge, common sense and love. Such is the course of action suggested to us by a study of the hidden side of things. But remember that this hidden side will not always remain hidden, for every day more and more of our fellow men learning to understand, because one by one, scattered here and there, more and more are learning to see it. Since it is obvious that this is the line of evolution and that the few who see now are only precursors of the many who will see hereafter, what in the light of these considerations may be predicted as the probable future of humanity? The future. Ingenious speculation upon this subject is a prominent feature of our modern fiction. It was attempted by Edward Bellamy in Looking Backward, and more recently by Mr. H. G. Wells in a number of quaintly interesting works. The line most usually taken is to pursue to a logical conclusion some of the many socialistic theories which are at present in the air, and to endeavor to calculate how these will work in practice among men as we know them. In one of the pleasantest of these books, In the Days of the Comet, Mr. Wells boldly introduces an entirely new factor, a change in the constitution of our atmosphere which suddenly inoculates mankind with common sense and fraternal feeling. When that is achieved, naturally many other obvious changes immediately follow. War becomes a ridiculous impossibility, our present social system is regarded with horror and amazement. Our business methods are thrown aside as unworthy of human beings, and so on. For this much of common sense we may surely presently hope in real life, though it will probably come much more slowly than in Mr. Wells' story. It may be of interest to see what light is thrown upon the problem of the future by the higher extensions of human consciousness of which we have spoken elsewhere. We find that from this point of view the future divides itself into three parts: the immediate, the remote, and the ultimate. And, oddly enough, it is of that which is furthest from us that we are able to speak with the greatest certainty, because the plan of evolution is visible to the higher sight, and its goal is clear. Nothing can interfere with the attainment of that goal, but the stages that lead up to it may be largely modified by the free will of the individuals concerned, and can, therefore, be foreseen only in their general outline. The end, so far as this cycle is concerned, is the accomplishment of the perfection of man. Each individual is to become something much more than what we now mean by a great and good man, for he is to be perfect in intellect and capacity as well as spirituality. All the intellect of the greatest philosopher or man of science, and far more. All the devotion and spirituality of the greatest of saints, and far more, these are to be the possessions of every unit of humanity before our cycle ends. To understand how such a stupendous result can be possible, we must grasp the plan by which evolution works. Obviously, on the ordinary theory of one poor little life of 70 years, followed by an eternity of purposeless joy or suffering, nothing of this sort could ever be achieved. But when once we realize that what we commonly call our life is only one day in the real life, and that we may have just as many of such days as are necessary for our development, we see that the command of Christ, "Be ye perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect," is no vain hyperbole, but a plain direction which we may reasonably expect to be able in due time to obey. The ultimate future, then, is perfection for every human being, no matter how low or undeveloped he may now be. Man will become more than man. This is what was meant in the early church by the doctrine of deification, to which many of the fathers refer. It is a matter not of pious opinion but of utter certainty to those who see the working of the scheme. Obviously, however, we are yet very far from this attainment. A long upward path lies before us before we can reach that far distant summit, and though on the whole it rises steadily, there must necessarily be many minor ups and downs in the future as there have been in the past. History shows us that hitherto the advancement mankind has been cyclic in its character. Each unit lives his long series of progressive lives, not in one race but in many successive races, in order that he may learn the special lessons which each has to teach. One can image a soul incarnating in ancient India to develop religious fervor, in classical Greece to gain artistic capacity, in the Rome of the Caesars to learn the immense power of discipline and order. Among ourselves at the present day to acquire the scientific habit of mind, and so on. The same great host of souls sweeps on through all ages, animating all these races in turn, and learning from all, but the races themselves arise, grow, decay and fall as they are needed. So when a nation loses its former glory and falls behind in the race, as, for example, modern Greece seems to have done in comparison with ancient Greece, it does not mean that a certain group of men is decadent. But that there are at the moment no souls who need precisely the type of training which that race at its best used to give, or that that training is now being given elsewhere. Consequently, the physical bodies of the descendants of those great men of old are now animated by souls of a lower type, while the great men themselves are now, as ever, in the forefront of evolution. But incarnated in some other race in order to grow still greater by developing in new directions. A race dies precisely as a class at a university might die if there were no longer any students taking up that particular subject. Clairvoyance enables us to examine a much larger section of the Earth's past history than can be reached along ordinary lines. And this fuller study of the past makes it possible, to some extent, to forecast by analogy some of the steps in the more immediate future. From such a study of the records it appears fairly certain that we are at the moment passing through a transition period, and that instead of representing, as we often fondly imagine, the highest development yet seen on Earth, we are in reality in the trough between two waves of progress. The democratic tendency of which some of us are so proud does not represent, as is generally supposed, the ultimate achievement of human wisdom, but is an experiment which was tried thoroughly and carried out to its logical conclusion thousands of years ago, and then abandoned in universal disgust as irrational, unworkable, and leading to endless confusion. If we are to repeat the course of that experiment, it seems unpleasantly certain that we shall have to pass through a good deal of this confusion and suffering once again, before we arrive at the stage of common sense which Mr. Wells so happily describes in the story previously mentioned. But when that madness is over and reason begins to reassert itself, it is manifest that there will be before us a period of far more rapid progress, in which we shall be able to avail ourselves of many aids which are not now at our disposal. The mere fact that the use of the higher faculties is slowly spreading among humanity, will presently make an almost incalculable difference in many directions. Imagine a condition in which all deception or fraud will be impossible, in which misunderstandings can no longer occur, because each man can read the thought of the other, in which no one will ever again be set to do work for which he is unfitted. Because from the first, parents and tutors will be able to see exactly the capacities of those committed to their care, in which a doctor cannot make mistakes, because he will see for himself exactly what is the matter with his patient, and can watch in detail the action of his remedies. Think what a difference it will make in our lives when death no longer separates us from those whom we love, because the astral world lies open to us just as does the physical. When it will be impossible for men any longer to doubt the reality of the divine scheme, because its lower stages are visibly before their eyes. Art and music will be far grander then, for astral colors and harmonies will be at our command as well as those which we now know. The problems of science will be solved, for the vast additions to human knowledge will blend all its branches into one perfect scheme. Geometry and mathematics will be far more satisfactory, because we shall then see what they really mean and what part they play in the splendid system of the worlds. Geometry as we have it now is but a fragment. It is an exoteric preparation for the esoteric reality. Because we have lost the true sense of space, the first step towards that knowledge is the cognition of the fourth dimension. For example, there are 5, and only 5, possible regular solids, those which are sometimes called the Platonic solids. To us, that is an interesting fact and no more, but the student who has been initiated into the mysteries knows that, with a point at one end of the series and a sphere at the other, they make a set of 7 which bears a mystic meaning. Explaining the relations one to the other of the different types of matter in the 7 planes of our solar system, and the power of the forces that play through them. Treated only from the physical plane, studied as ends in themselves, instead of as means to an end, geometry and mathematics must always remain incomplete, like beautiful avenues that lead nowhere. Every feature of life will be wider and fuller, because we shall see much more than we do now of the beautiful and wonderful world in which our lot is cast. Understanding more, we cannot but admire and love more, so we shall be infinitely happier, as we draw steadily nearer to that ultimate perfection which is absolute happiness, because it is union with the eternal love. Chapter 25. The Way to Seership. I have no doubt that many people will find it difficult to believe much of what I have written. I sympathize with them, because I realize quite well how fantastic much of it would have appeared to me before I had studied these matters or was able to see them for myself. I know also that, without throwing the slightest imputation upon my good faith, many people will inevitably doubt whether I have seen all these things clearly and reported them exactly. One quaint criticism was offered by a friend, who said, "It seems as though you had written this to justify your own peculiarities, for the things that you recommend here are just those in which you differ from many others." The friend was confusing cause and effect. If I do, or try to do, these various things which I have prescribed, it is just because I have seen with regard to them what I have described in the book. If, however, there are those, as there well may be, who find these things hard to believe, I can only say to them that the best way to get corroboration of any of the theosophical ideas is to take them for granted and work with them. For then it will soon be found that they prove themselves. It is within the power of every man to develop the faculties by which all this has been seen, nor is there any mystery as to the method by which such development is achieved. These faculties will inevitably come to every one in the course of his evolution, but most men still stand a long way from the point at which they are likely to unfold, though sporadic flashes of clairvoyance are by no means uncommon. And many people have at least a certain amount of sensitiveness. Let me not be misunderstood when I say that the ordinary man is still far from the probability of possessing these senses. I do not mean because he is not good enough, for it is not a question of goodness at all, although it is certainly true that if a man of impure or cruel tendency should acquire such faculties he would do far more harm than good with them. To himself and to every one else. I mean that the whole trend of modern life and thought is unfavorable to such unfolding. And that the man who wishes to undertake it must to a great extent abstract himself from the life of the world and get himself into an entirely different atmosphere. Such a life as I have prescribed on this book is precisely that which would put a man into a favorable position for the growth of these faculties, and it is not difficult to see how far from this is the ordinary life of the present day. That is why it seems unhopeful to suggest to the average person that he should undertake the task of opening out these powers. They are unquestionably within his reach. But to get himself into a position from which he could begin a real effort towards them means already much radical alteration in the life which he has been accustomed to live. And then, even when he has gradually eradicated from his body all the poisonous products of flesh, alcohol and tobacco, when he has raised his aspirations from the lower to the higher. When he has cast out from himself all traces of self-consciousness or impurity, even then the effort required is greater than many men could make. The eventual result is as certain as the working out of a problem in Euclid, but the time occupied may be long, an iron determination and an indomitable will are required for the work. And these are faculties which at present are the possession of but few. Nevertheless, what man has done man can do, if he will. I who write have succeeded in this thing, and I have known others who have succeeded. And all who have gained that prize feel it to be far more than worth all the efforts put forth in the course of its attainment. Let me then conclude my book by a plain statement, made as simply as possible, of what these powers are, by means of which it has been written, why they are desirable, and how they may be acquired. A fish is a denizen of our world, just as a man is, but it is obvious that his conception of that world must be exceedingly imperfect. Confined as he is to his one element, what can he know of the beauty of landscapes, of the glory of sunsets, of the far-reaching interests of our varied and complex human life? He lives on a globe of which he knows almost nothing. Yet no doubt he is perfectly satisfied, and thinks that what he knows is all there is to know. It is not flattering to our self-conceit, yet it is an absolute fact, that the majority of mankind are precisely in the position of the fish. They are living in a world, only one small department of which is within their ken, yet they are quite content with that, and are usually blankly ignorant or fiercely incredulous as to the wider and grander life which surrounds them on every side. How do we know of this wider life? Not only by religious revelation, but because there are men who have learnt how to see, not indeed the whole of our world, but at least much more of it than is seen by most people. These are the men whom we call seers, or clairvoyants. How do they see more than others? By the opening of latent faculties which every one possesses, but which few as yet know how to use. Every man has other vehicles of matter finer than the physical, what St. Paul calls a spiritual body, as well as a natural body. Just as through the senses of the physical body we become aware of physical things, so through what may be called the senses of these finer bodies do we become aware of higher things. The advantages of such sight are manifold. For its possessor most of the problems of life are solved. For him it is not a matter of belief but of knowledge that man survives what is called death, that eternal justice rules the world, that there is no possibility of final failure for anyone, and that, however deceptive appearances may be, in reality all things are working together for good. The man who is a seer can not only learn much more than others, he can also be much more helpful to his fellows than others. Since this seership is so desirable, since it lies latent in every one of us, is it possible for us to develop it? Certainly it is possible, if we are willing to take the trouble, but for most men it is no light task, for it means self-control and self-denial, perseverance and single-mindedness. Other men have done it, so you can do it. But you cannot do it unless you are prepared to throw all your strength into the effort, with an iron determination to succeed. The motive, too, must be pure and good. The man whose inquiry is prompted merely by curiosity, or by an ignoble desire to obtain advantage or wealth for himself, will do well to take warning in time, and leave any sort of occult training severely alone until mental and moral growth are further advanced. For added power and knowledge mean added responsibility, and the higher sight may be a curse instead of a blessing to a man who is not ready for it. There are many ways by which the inner sight may be opened, and most of them are full of danger, and decidedly to be avoided. It may be done by the use of certain drugs, by self-hypnotization, or by mesmerism. But all these methods may bring with them evil results which far outweigh the gain. There is, however, one process which can by no possibility do harm, and that is the way of thought control and meditation. I do not say that the undertaking is easy. On the contrary, it is excessively difficult, but I do say that it can be done by determined effort, because it has been done. The man who wishes to attempt this must begin by acquiring control over his mind, a Herculean task in itself. He must learn to concentrate himself upon whatever he may be doing, so that it shall be as well done as is possible for him to do it. He must learn to wield his mind as a skillful fencer wields his weapon, turning it at will in this direction or that, and able to hold it as firmly as he wishes. Try to keep your mind fixed on one definite subject for 5 minutes. Before half the time has passed you will find that wandering thoughts have slipped in unawares, and that the mind has soared far away beyond the limits which you set for it. That means that it is not perfectly under your control, and to remedy this condition of affairs is our first step, by no means an easy one. Nothing but steady practice will give you this power. But fortunately that practice can be had all day long, in business as well as during hours of leisure. If you are writing a letter, keep your mind on that letter, so that it may be written perfectly, clearly, quickly. If you are reading a book, keep your mind on that book, so that you may fully grasp the author's meaning, and gain from it all that he intended you to gain. In addition to thus practicing concentration in the ordinary course of life, it will help you greatly if you set apart a certain time each day for special effort along these lines. Early morning is the most suitable. But, at any rate, it should be at time when you can be sure of being undisturbed, and it should always be at the same hour, for regularity is of the essence of the prescription. Sit down quietly and get your mind perfectly calm. Agitation or worry of any sort is absolutely fatal to success. Then turn the mind upon some subject selected beforehand, and consider it attentively and exhaustively, never allowing your thoughts to stray aside from it in the slightest degree, even for a moment. Of course at first they will stray. But each time you must drag them back again and start afresh. You will find it best to take concrete subjects at first. It is only after much practice that the more abstract can profitably be considered. When through long habitude all this has become thoroughly familiar to you, when you have attained the power of concentration, and when the mind is well under your control, another step may be taken. Begin now to choose for the subject of your morning meditation the highest ideal that you know. What the ideal is does not matter in the least, for we are dealing now with basic facts and not with outer forms. The Hindu may take Sri Krishna, the Mohammedan, Allah, the Parsi, Zoroaster, the Buddhist, the Lord Buddha, and the Christian, the Lord Christ, or if he be a Catholic, perhaps the Blessed Virgin or one of the saints. It matters not at all, so long as the contemplation of that ideal arouses within the man all the ardor, devotion and reverence of which he is capable. Let him contemplate it with ecstasy, till his soul is filled with its glory and its beauty. And then, putting forth all the strength which his long practice of concentration had given him, let him make a determined effort to raise his consciousness to that ideal, to merge himself in it, to become one with it. He may make that endeavor many times, and yet fail. But if he perseveres, and if his attempt is made in all truth and unselfishness, there will come a time when suddenly he knows that he has succeeded, when the blinding light of the higher life bursts upon him. And he realizes that ideal 1,000-fold more than ever before. Then he sinks back again into the light of common day, yet that one momentary glimpse can never be forgotten, and even if he goes no further, life will never look the same to him as it did before he saw. But if he persists in his endeavor, that splendid flash of glory will come to him again and yet again, each time staying with him longer and longer. Until at last he will find himself able to raise his consciousness to that higher level whenever he wishes, to observe, to examine and explore that phase of life just as he now does this. And thus he joins the ranks of those who know, instead of guessing or vaguely hoping, and he becomes a power for good in the world.